Today, I'm going to share 3 stories that are all about people who went to great lengths to make themselves look good. But in each case, as you'll see, it completely backfires. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is really excited to see a new movie, make sure you tell them the ending of that movie right as they're sitting down to watch it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in late February of 2023, a 26-year-old man named Julio Bermejo walked toward a park in the city of Puno, Peru, with his girlfriend, Juanita. They were on the way to the park to meet Julio's 2 best friends, who he was finally going to be introducing Juanita to. To this point, they knew he had a girlfriend, but they had never actually met. And this, in and of itself, was actually kind of odd, because again, these are Julio's best friends, and Julio and Juanita had actually been together for a while now. But Julio had sort of always been a little hesitant to introduce her to his friends because he knew, Juanita was just a little bit different. She was odd. And he knew that his friends might, pick up on that and maybe even make fun of him for it. He didn't know. He was worried that it would cause weirdness amongst the friends if they, had a chance to interact with his girlfriend. And so he just kind of kept her secret. But his friends knew he was dating Juanita, and they just really wanted to meet her. And so they kept pressuring him. And finally, he's like, you know what? We'll just go to the park. We'll meet up. I'm sure it'll be fine. And in order to ensure that this meeting would go as well as it could, Julio had also brought along with him as they're walking to the park. He had this big red cooler. And inside of it was all this rum and some cups and ice and stuff that they could drink while they're at the park. And for what it's worth, you're not allowed to drink in public in Peru. And Julio knew this. And so he was sort of weary of the fact that he's lugging this, obvious case of drinks out to a public park. And he was going to be drinking in public, but he felt like it was worth the risk. He would go out there, they'd have a couple of drinks, his friends would meet Juanita, it would all be fine. Eventually, Julio and Juanita reached the edge of the park. And up ahead, Julio could see his 2 friends waiting by this crumbling wall within the park. So most of Puno was covered in all these old ruins because there was this ancient civilization called the Incas who had lived there hundreds of years ago. And so this crumbling wall that his friends were sitting on was quite literally like an artifact, a remnant of the past. But it was sort of so commonplace in this area that people didn't even notice them. It was just sort of part of the landscape. And so Juanita and Julio's big red cooler full of rum, they lumbered their way through the park, dodging different, ruins that were jutting out of the ground, all the way over to the wall where the 2 friends were. And they actually hadn't seen them approaching. And so it was only when they kind of just were standing right in front of them that the friends looked and saw Julio, saw Juanita. And Julio, right away, he's sort of trying to gauge their reaction to Juanita and to this whole situation. But pretty quickly, his friends were, just pretty cool. And they were interested in Juanita. And, they quickly wanted to learn more about Juanita. And it was just like kind of easy. And Julio, he opened up the cooler right away. He got the cups out. He's filling them up with rum and soda. And all the friends are drinking. They're having a good time. And Julio's like, man, I was worried about nothing. My friends, they think Juanita is great. Yeah, she's different, but they think she's great. This has gone as well as it could have. And also, definitely the rum was helping. And so for a while, all 4 of them were just sitting around this, crumbling wall, drinking their rum. They're having a good time. And then at some point, Julio, who was facing his 2 friends, his friends, they sort of looked up and they had this look come over their face like they were worried about something that clearly was behind Julio. They sort of gasped when they saw it. And Julio, he's like, oh no, like, is it the police? Because they're out here drinking publicly and they're getting a little bit drunk and a little bit rowdy, with the exception of Juanita. She had drank the least of the group, perhaps to maintain some level of decency, perhaps. But, the two friends and Julio, they were pretty drunk and being loud. And so Julio, he turns around and his stomach just drops because, yep, here come the police. There are two officers coming over and he's thinking, the jig's up. They're going to clearly see that we are drinking in public. We can't even hide it. And so the officers, they walk over and, the friends are sort of panicking. They're putting their cups down. And Julio, he's just sort of resigned to his fate here. He's going to get in trouble. And the officers, they come over and they see the cups and they can clearly tell this group of people is drinking. But when they looked into that red cooler, that big red cooler that Julio had brought along, when they saw what was in there, they backed up and they told Julio to stay right where he was. So Julio and Juanita had actually been together for years. And despite his insecurities about her, about their relationship, he was ultimately pretty eager for his friends to finally meet her. But taking her to the park that day turned out to be a really big mistake. Because when the police arrived on the scene and they looked in Julio's red cooler, probably expecting to see alcohol, because that's very likely why they approached them in the first place, they did see alcohol, but they also saw Juanita. So Julio was right to be on edge about how his friends might react to seeing his girlfriend, seeing Juanita, because she was so different, right? That's his concern. And she was very different than your sort of average girlfriend, let's say. Because Juanita was actually an 800-year-old mummified man from the pre-Hispanic era, the period when the Incan civilization ruled the area. Julio's father had acquired Juanita, this mummy, decades ago. So Juanita had actually been a fixture in Julio's life since he was born. Now, Julio's best friends, really all of his friends, knew that, his family had this mummy, but they didn't take it seriously when Julio referred to the mummy as his girlfriend. Again, this is an 800-year-old mummified man, that he calls his girlfriend. They thought it was a joke. But, when it seemed like it wasn't a joke, when it seemed like Julio apparently had a real relationship with this mummy, the friends begged him to bring Juanita out. They wanted to see this amazing artifact. But they didn't realize that request, when they finally pushed Julio to come out to this park with Juanita in his cooler, because that's how he transported her, that would actually destroy their friend's actual love life. Because Julio was not joking when he called Juanita his girlfriend. He had very real, very deep feelings for this mummy. He'd even convinced himself that she was like an active participant in their relationship and sort of kept him in line, according to Julio. He said that Juanita would hold his hand and would poke his feet whenever he misbehaved. And so when those two officers in the park came over to Julio and his friends and they looked in the cooler, they saw, Juanita, this mummy, partially inside of this cooler along with the rum. And so right off the bat, Julio and his friends, they're getting in trouble for that alcohol. But also, Julio was arrested and charged with the illegal possession of a historical item. But as of 2023, there's been no update on this case. As for Juanita, like the actual mummy, it was confiscated by the Ministry of Culture for research purposes. And that means very likely that she and Julio will be separated forever. This episode is sponsored by AG1. Wherever summer takes you, whether it's Hawaii or the Grand Canyon or somewhere in between, bring your routine with you and count on AG1 to support your overall health along the way. My schedule can be very unpredictable, especially when I travel, and so healthy habits are usually the first thing to fall off. That's why I appreciate having one simple thing I can take with me and do every day without overthinking it. Since adding AG1 to my daily routine and also specifically my travel routine, I've noticed that I feel more energized. And I really like knowing that I'm supporting my overall wellness, all without having to juggle a bunch of different supplements. AG1 makes it easy by closing nutrient gaps and supporting gut health. Just one scoop of AG1 delivers 75 plus vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients to improve digestion and support energy and immune health. And the key nutrients in AG1 Next Gen were shown to be quickly and easily absorbed into the body. Get a free AG1 travel kit featuring 7 travel sticks and a travel case added to your welcome kit with your first AG1 subscription order. One afternoon in 1984, a man named Dmitry carried a cardboard box down the hallway of this high-rise apartment building in the city of Kramatorsk, Ukraine. And this building was basically brand new. It was one of a bunch of developments that had been built right before the Moscow Olympics just 4 years earlier in 1980 as part of a push to show the world that the Soviet Union was a very successful and prosperous place. So very much by design, everything that they had built was very shiny and very modern and impressive, like this apartment building. And pretty much everybody in the area had been really desperate to get one of these new apartments, and Dmitry had lucked out. So a few weeks ago, Dmitry had been notified that one of the units had suddenly opened up, and he jumped at the opportunity to move in. He and his family had never lived in a place this nice before. I mean, there were brand new appliances, and the building had thick concrete walls with great soundproofing, so they didn't have to listen to their neighbors chat or watch TV like they had in many other places they lived before. Like, this was a huge upgrade. So today, Dmitry and his wife and 2 sons had basically spent the entire afternoon hauling their furniture in and getting situated because they're like, we want to move in here as fast as possible. His family was inside the unit now, unpacking basically everything else, and Dmitry was bringing up one of the very last boxes. But as he headed down the hallway toward his apartment, Unit 85, he saw a neighbor open up her door right up ahead, and the neighbor looked out at him. And as Dmitry got closer to this neighbor, he noticed that this woman looked incredibly sad and just kind of tired, like life had beaten her down. She was also really pale and very thin and gaunt, and she had bags under her eyes. And she was watching Dmitry with this strange expression on her face, almost like pity for Dmitry. And Dmitry, despite this initial reaction to what she looked like, he doesn't know her, and this is his neighbor after all. So he was about to stop and introduce himself to her. But right as he was about to, she suddenly went back inside of her unit and closed the door. The whole thing was just very weird. And Dmitry, after the door had shut, he just stood there for a second, wondering if he should knock and ask the woman if there was some kind of problem, like was she okay? But in general, Dmitry was naturally kind of a quiet, introverted guy, and he very much preferred to mind his own business about pretty much everything. So he decided he would just leave the woman alone, which was pretty clearly what she wanted anyways. I mean, she's the one who shut the door and disappeared on him. So after a minute, he just walked the rest of the way down the hallway. He went inside of his unit, and he carried this cardboard box that he had lugged up here into the bedroom that his teenage sons were going to share. And when he got in there, he saw his boys were standing up on one of the mattresses, trying to hang a decorative rug on the wall behind their beds to kind of, freshen up the place. And Dmitry, he was glad to see that. It seemed like his sons were, leaning in to making this space their own. And so Dmitry, he set the box down and looked around their room. And with all their stuff there, it was already starting to feel like home. And he was sure that, despite the weirdness with his neighbor, that this has got to be the beginning of a really just amazing, new exciting chapter for he and his family. But Dmitry quickly realized that Not everything in this building was as amazing as he thought it was. I mean, he'd already had that weird run-in with his neighbor, and it would turn out that was just the tip of the iceberg. Even though, his apartment and this whole building was undeniably nice and beautiful and modern, basically all of their neighbors were not nice. It was not just that one woman who appeared to be quite rude on that first day there. It was like every single person Dmitri ran into in this entire complex was quiet and sullen and grumpy and definitely not interested in talking to Dmitri. And then more than that, you have all these people that clearly didn't want anything to do with Dmitri and his family, but it was almost like all the time, the entire place was just silent. I mean, there was good soundproofing in this building, no doubt, but every time he walked down the hallway, it was just silent. Like nobody was making any noise in any of the apartment buildings. It was like this weird vibe that sort of hung over this whole place, like a sense of gloom and doom sort of persisted everywhere. And Dmitri just couldn't explain it. Like of all places to have that feeling be so present, why here? This is such a nice place. But Dmitri and his family, they stuck it out. They stayed in this apartment. And, despite how weird, it was, and it continued to be as weird as I've described here, pretty much the whole time they were there, Dmitri and his family, they tried to make the best of it. But a couple of years after they had moved into Unit 85, Dmitri's older son started feeling unusually tired and weak, sort of similar to how the people in the building all seemed to act. And at first, Dmitri thought his son was just stressed with school or his social life or something, and maybe he just needed more sleep. But his son's symptoms just kept getting worse. And when Dmitri and his wife eventually took their son to the doctor, they found out that unfortunately their son had leukemia, which is a blood cancer. Now, this was obviously a total shock to the family because, this whole time they'd been chalking it up to, he needs more sleep, right? But to find out it was something so serious, they didn't even know what to think. And on top of that, Dmitri's son, who had the leukemia, he had always been like a really active, healthy kid. So this just felt like it came out of nowhere. But now he had to undergo cancer treatment and spend most of his time resting in bed. And despite doing those things, he just continued to get worse. A few months after Dmitri's older son got sick, Dmitri was sitting inside of an exam room at the doctor's office with his younger son, who was now also sick. He had a lot of the same symptoms as his brother. So Dmitri had taken him for blood tests right away, fearing, he could have leukemia too. And so now they were waiting for the doctor to come back with those blood test results to see if that was the case. And when the doctor did finally come back into the room, Dmitri could tell by the look on the doctor's face that whatever they were going to say was going to be bad. And so the doctor, he sat down and said that Dmitri's younger son did also have leukemia. Dmitri was shattered. He was in complete disbelief here. He asked the doctor, how is it possible that both of my children could develop the same type of cancer in the same year? And the doctor said, well, there is an answer for that. This was hereditary. The whole family had a genetic predisposition to leukemia. That afternoon, Dmitri brought his youngest son home and told his wife and his older son the terrible news. And Dmitri just couldn't help but feel incredibly guilty, like this was all his fault for passing his bad genes onto his kids. So once, everybody had begun to process the news and the sons were both in bed, Dmitri, just who didn't know what to do with himself now, he felt so terrible, he just decided to go out for a walk to clear his head. And so he did that. He went out, he walked around, and it didn't really work. He still had so much on his mind, so many bad thoughts passing through his mind. But when he got back to the building after his walk, as he approached the main entrance, he saw one of his neighbors sitting out on the steps, smoking a cigarette. It was actually that woman that he had first seen when he had moved in, the one who had poked her head into the hallway and then quickly closed the door without saying hello. Since that day, Dmitri had never spoken to her. He hadn't even tried to talk to her. It was clear she didn't want anything to do with him or anyone else for that matter. And certainly tonight was not the moment he was going to go, talk to this woman. But very much to his surprise, as Dmitri, walked right past her and began walking up the steps to go inside the building, she actually turned and looked at him and just asked him, "Is everything okay?" And Dmitri was so caught off guard by this that he found himself just suddenly, very emotionally, sort of blurting out everything about his son's illnesses and how it was all his fault. And as his neighbor listened to him, she didn't seem surprised at all by what he was saying. And when he was done talking, she didn't ask a single question about it. In fact, she just nodded her head like, "Yep, that's too bad," as if she knew this was already going on, even though there was no way she could have known this stuff. And so when it was clear their conversation wasn't really going to go much further than Dmitri just sort of vomiting out all this information and her nodding, and that was sort of it, Dmitri was going to go back into the building, but she stopped him. And she did ask him a question. She asked him, "Do you know anything about the tenants who lived in your unit before you?" He said no. All he knew is that somebody had lived there, and then apparently they had left. That created the opening, and he had jumped at the chance to move in. That's all he knew. And so she told him that, well, actually, there's a story behind why this cleared up, why that unit cleared up. She said the previous tenants were a mother and her 2 teenage kids, and they had all died within 2 years of moving in. That's why it opened up. And they had died from leukemia. After hearing this, Dmitri couldn't help but feel like, okay, this doesn't seem like my kids got leukemia because this is hereditary. It feels like something else caused my kids to get sick that very likely is happening in my apartment. Like, how is it possible that both my kids got leukemia and the previous tenants who were in this unit also got leukemia? Like, there's no way. That's just coincidence. No way. And so Dmitri became absolutely obsessed with this idea that he was going to get to the bottom of whatever was going on inside of that apartment. And so over the next year, Dmitri made multiple serious efforts to get an inspector to come out and look at the apartment. He wanted them to check for a gas leak or toxic chemicals or something in the soil. But when he talked to building management, they just insisted that they'd already looked into all those things and everything was fine. Like, this is just hereditary. It's just coincidental, drop it. But Dmitri couldn't let it go. And he kept pushing, asking anyone he could to just try to help him figure out if there's some external factor that's causing his family to become ill. But it all went nowhere. Basically, people just started ignoring his requests, and Dmitri felt like there was nothing he could do. By 1987, only a few years after Dmitri and his family had moved into Unit 85, Dmitri's older son passed away from leukemia, and Dmitri's younger son continued to get sicker. Meanwhile, a rumor began to spread around the apartment building and also just across the whole area that Unit 85 of that apartment building must be cursed. 2 years later, on a cold morning in 1989, Dmitri came home from the hospital where his younger son was being treated to grab some clean clothes for himself and his wife. He and his wife were now spending virtually all their time at the hospital. It felt like they were at this point just waiting for their second son to die. That was the direction this seemed to be going. And so, of course, this is like a really miserable, awful time for Dmitri and his wife. And so when he got back to his apartment and after he got those clothes, instead of just immediately leaving and rushing back to the hospital, which was just so awful, Dmitri just wandered into his son's bedroom and just took a minute for himself. He sat down on one of the beds and he stared at that decorative rug that was hanging on the wall, which had been there since the first day they'd moved in. His sons had put it up there. And when he looked back at that day, he remembered how excited and how hopeful his sons had been and how he and his wife had been for their new life here. Like, this felt like such an amazing opportunity. But that day, that move-in day, felt like a lifetime ago. Ever since then, nothing had gone the way they had expected. And so Dmitri wondered if maybe the rumor was true, that Unit 85, where they lived, maybe it really was cursed. And while he was thinking about that, something on the rug, the decorative rug on the wall, caught his eye. And so Dmitri, he got up and he walked over to this rug to get a better look. And at first, he couldn't even tell what he was looking at. But upon closer inspection, he knew something was wrong here. And it was wrong enough that he actually ran out of the room, picked up the phone, and called emergency services. So when Dmitri had moved in, he'd been so excited that he'd basically overlooked a lot of red flags. He never asked why the previous tenants would leave behind such a great apartment. Like, he didn't know it was because they died after living there for a very short amount of time. But he didn't ask. And he also didn't ask about why basically everybody on the premises just seemed so sad and lifeless all the time. Like, everybody acted that way. He never asked about it. And so ultimately, Dmitri's opinion of this place, of Unit 85 in this building, is that, you know what, there can be nothing wrong with living here. I mean, this is a modern place. Everything's so new and beautiful. Like, it has to be a safe place to live, right? But it would turn out being brand new and modern was actually what made this apartment building so dangerous. When this building was constructed, the Soviet government had been in such a rush to show off how wonderful and rich the country was in time for the Moscow Olympics that they'd made a terrible mistake. During the construction of this whole apartment building, the crew had lost a very small but very important piece of equipment. It was a capsule on a machine that measured the density of soil, which they used at the quarry where they were carving the stone that was used to build the apartments. Now, work had been paused so the crew could find this capsule. But the government also really didn't want there to be a big delay here because they wanted to show off this amazing place, in time for the Olympics. So after a week, even though the capsule was still missing, they just called off the search and resumed construction, figuring the capsule must just be somewhere in the quarry. But the capsule was not in the quarry. It ended up embedded into the stone walls of Unit 85. And this was a big problem because that capsule contained a substance called cesium-137, which is extremely radioactive. And so for the next 8 years, the people who lived in that apartment building, in particular in and around Unit 85, were receiving constant radiation exposure. That's why all of Dmitri's neighbors seemed sad and pale and lethargic. And that's also why Dmitri's family and the family before him who had lived inside of Unit 85, it's why they got leukemia. Dmitri discovered the awful truth in 1989 when he was in his son's bedroom and he was looking at the rug hanging on the wall. What he noticed on the rug was there was what appeared to be a burn mark. And when he looked more closely, he realized that the burn was coming from the wall itself that the rug was pressed against. Like there was something in the wall causing this rug to burn. And so not really having any idea what that was, but knowing that, something odd has been going on here, he suspected for many years, and no one's really looked. This seems really odd. I better call the authorities. Well, when he did, the authorities came out and they inspected the apartment. And when they cut into that wall behind the rug, what did they find? The missing capsule. In total, 6 people who lived in this apartment building died, and 17 more were disabled, all because of the radiation in Unit 85. However, despite that being sort of hard facts, nobody was ever held accountable for this deadly incident. On the evening of September 17, 1896, a detective named John White dug a shovel into the ground outside of a home in Evanston, Illinois. So Detective White worked for the Evanston police, and that morning, the owner of the home that he was currently digging in front of had come in to report that he had found bones buried on his property. So White had been sent out there to see if they were human or animal. Now, White had actually already stopped by the home earlier to inspect a few of the bones the homeowner had pulled out of the ground, and his initial thought was they were likely just from a deer or some other animal, so he was not expecting this to be human bones. However, he had still come back to fully excavate this yard because this property was only a quarter mile from the former home of the infamous serial killer named H.H. Holmes, who had been caught just 2 years earlier. And H.H. Holmes had confessed to 27 murders, but the police believed that there were dozens or even hundreds more that they didn't know about. So if any of the bones that were found on this property were human, it was then very likely they were connected to this serial killer. And that would be a huge find for Detective White at a time when he desperately needed a win. Because just a week ago, a reporter from the Chicago Chronicle had published a very unflattering story about Detective White, about how he had bungled a case, which had made White sort of like the laughingstock of the police force. It had been very embarrassing. But more than embarrassment, I mean, Detective White cared a lot about his reputation. He cared about being a good detective. So he had been looking for a way to sort of get that story out of everybody's heads. And he thought, like, what better way to do that than to be the detective that finds these missing bones, these potentially missing bones of these victims that had never been found. And so White, he's out here, part of this bigger excavation of this property, he takes a shovel and he begins to dig. And at some point, he hits something hard in the ground. At that point, White took a shovel away and he reached down and he carefully brushed away the dirt from whatever he hit. And eventually, when he revealed what it was clearly bone, but more than that, it was clearly human bone. It was an entire human skull. And so White, he was thrilled. This is like, in some ways, the best thing he could have found. This is undeniably human remains here. And that was sort of what he was hoping he would find. And there also wasn't much decay or discoloration on the skull, which suggested it had not been buried for very long, at least not more than a few years, which also highly suggested it was connected to H.H. Holmes, who had been caught 2 years ago. And so White, he's feeling really good. Like he's got the big find here. This is exactly what he hoped would happen. He knew the medical examiner would obviously have to look things over and confirm some things, but it certainly seemed like he had effectively struck gold. And it also seemed like this was going to be White's chance to really stick it to that reporter who just a week earlier had written that horrible article about him. Now look at White. Look what he was doing now. Nobody would remember that terrible article, and everybody would remember this. And so White, he stops digging, he wraps the skull in a blanket, and he heads back to the police station. And when he went in there, who was already inside talking to another officer? None other than that very reporter who had written that embarrassing article about White a week earlier. And so White, he's thrilled. Like, this is the best case scenario for him. He's got that skull that's wrapped in a blanket. And he made a point of, as he walked down the middle of the aisle of this big room full of all the other officers and desks and this reporter, he made a point to really indicate that he had something important in his hands and he was walking with a purpose here. But he really wanted to get the reporter's attention. And so he walks down the aisle, he's got his skull, and the reporter, he notices and stops what he's doing. And he turns and he looks at White and he's like, "Hey, what do you got there?" And so White, he turns to this reporter and, he stares at him like, "I know who you are. I know what you wrote about me." But what he does is he unfurls the blanket and reveals the human skull to the reporter. And the reporter's looking at it like, what in the world? And White's like, "Yeah, he's kind of gloating as he's doing this. He's like, "Yeah, I was digging up over at that property about a quarter mile from where H.H. Holmes lived. And I think I found another victim, a victim that nobody knew about. Yep, here it is. So there you go." And the reporter, he's staring at the skull. He's hearing what Detective White has said. And White could see the gears are turning in the reporter's head. Like, this is a huge story. And the reporter's like, oh my goodness, like, thank you. I got to write about this. This is amazing. I can't believe you've found this. This is incredible. And so White's like, this is the greatest thing. He's going to write a new article. It's going to feature me. I'm going to be the hero. And also, how great is it that this article is going to be written by him? Like, the same guy who talked bad about me is now going to make me out to be some kind of a hero. This is perfect. The next morning, when White walked into the police station, he was greeted with all his fellow officers cheering and clapping for him, congratulating him on this huge breakthrough, the find of this skull. So that Chicago Chronicle reporter had immediately written a story about White's big find, about finding the skull in that yard, and it had been front page news that morning. And so all of White's colleagues, everybody had read the story. He was the star. And to White's delight, the reporter even openly speculated that skull might even belong to H.H. Holmes's former wife, Minnie Williams, who'd completely disappeared a few months after they had gotten married, which was a huge revelation because nobody knew what happened to her. And it was like, wow, Detective White, you figured it out. You found her. And so Detective White had like the best day of his life. Like, this is redemption. Everything is great. Until that night. On his way home from work, Detective White stopped at this very crowded newsstand to pick up a copy of the evening edition. He grabbed a newspaper off the shelf and he looked at the front page, and unsurprisingly, his story, the Bones story, was still very much front page news. But as he read through the article, his stomach dropped. And then he heard a noise coming from all around him that made his blood run cold. It would turn out, other than the human skull that White dug up on that property, all the other bones that so far had been found on that man's property had been horse bones. And more than that, the skull did not belong to a murder victim. So, unfortunately, White's big breakthrough was not a breakthrough at all. But Detective White, he actually knew that. He had known that from the first second he stepped on that property. Ever since that embarrassing article had been published about White that week earlier, he'd become obsessed, not just with fixing his reputation, but specifically with getting revenge on that reporter who wrote it. And this bone scenario had given him, in his mind, the perfect opportunity. He had come up with this elaborate plan to plant the human skull, pretend to find it, and then tell that specific reporter all about it, in hopes that the reporter would write a completely incorrect story and then get publicly humiliated, exactly the way White felt like he had been humiliated. But White had underestimated this reporter, because the reporter, after seeing the skull that White showed him and writing that big article about how this skull could be connected to H.H. Holmes, the reporter, he gets that story out the door that morning. It's this big hit. After that, on that same day, the reporter went to the medical examiner to ask for more information about the skull. And quickly, he learned about the other bones, and he learned that this skull very likely was not connected to H.H. Holmes. And the reporter began to see that this looked like a setup. He saw through White's scheme. And so that evening, a whole new article had come out about White and his big discovery. And basically what it said was White was a petty moron who tampered with evidence and thought he could pass off horse bones for human ones. And so White, after reading the story and realizing what a terrible position he was in now, that sound he heard all around him that made his blood run cold was the sound of the other people all around him reading this article and laughing at his expense. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the evening of the 2nd of November, 1971,
16-year-old Ronald Johnson was tending sheep on his family's farm in Delphos, Kansas, when he suddenly heard a low rumbling sound. Looking up, he saw a glowing, mushroom-shaped metallic object hovering just a few feet above the ground. The craft suddenly accelerated into the night sea. On the evening of March 26, 1971, an off-duty special constable was walking his dog near an abandoned flint mill in Burton-upon-Trent, Staffordshire. And as they walked past a crumbling brick wall that used to be part of the main grinding facility, his dog suddenly stopped at a shallow mound of earth and began sniffing the damp dirt intently. So, the man gave the leather leash a firm tug to keep them moving, but the dog flatly refused to obey, and instead started frantically digging at the soil with both front paws. Now, the man figured his dog had just found a buried animal bone left over from a stray fox, so he stepped forward and reached his bare hand down into the hole to pull the object out of the mud. But the moment his fingers brushed against the smooth surface, his breath hitched, his hand jerked back, and his stomach dropped because he realized this shape was distinctly human. TXT +4. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do. And we upload multiple times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button over for a nice steak dinner. But when you serve the food, just hand them a wet dish sponge covered in barbecue sauce. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Now, Burton-upon-Trent was a relatively quiet brewing town in Staffordshire, England. And the people who lived there, mostly worked hard in the local breweries, went to the local pubs on the weekends, and basically knew all of their neighbors by their first names. March in this part of the country was famously cold, damp, and unforgiving, with bitter winds constantly whipping off the nearby River Trent. And the off-duty special constable who found himself standing in the freezing mud that evening was exactly that kind of reliable, community-focused guy. He took his job very seriously, even when he wasn't officially wearing his uniform and was technically off the clock. And he spent a lot of his free time just walking his dog around the rural outskirts of the town. So he knew the local landscape, the winding trails, and the muddy riverbanks like the back of his hand. And one of his usual evening routes took him right past an old abandoned flint mill that sat quietly by the edge of the river. TXT +1. The mill had been completely out of use for years, and the area around it was heavily overgrown, with tall weeds, thick brush, and decaying wooden structures. But it was usually completely empty and incredibly quiet. And so it was a perfect place to let an energetic dog roam around off the leash and stretch its legs after a long day indoors. But on this particular evening, March 26th, 1971, the routine walk did not go as planned. After his dog started aggressively digging into that shallow mound of earth, and he reached down into the dirt, he realized immediately that the smooth piece of bone protruding from the mud was actually the top part of a human skull. And so he grabbed his dog firmly by the collar, backed slowly away from the mound, and immediately ran back to the main road to find a public telephone to call the local police. TXT +1. A short time later, several police vehicles pulled up to the abandoned flint mill, their tires crunching loudly on the old gravel driveway. And officers quickly jumped out and used thick tape to rope off the entire area around the shallow grave. And as the sun went down and the temperature dropped, Sergeant Thomas brought his forensic team in with heavy shovels, small hand trowels, and portable floodlights. "Take it extremely slow," Thomas said. "Yes, Sergeant," one of the officers replied. So the crime scene technicians got down on their hands and knees, and they began to carefully brush the wet dirt away from the mound. And it was an incredibly slow, tedious process because they didn't want to accidentally damage whatever was buried down there in the dark. But after about an hour of continuous digging, one of the officers was clearing dirt near the lower half of the mound when his stiff brush uncovered a flash of bright color. "Hold on, what is that?" the officer asked. "Looks like a piece of fabric," Thomas said. Just clear the dirt all the way around it. And as the officer cleared more soil away, he revealed a pair of vibrant pink socks. They were just sitting there fully intact in the damp earth, looking completely out of place in the dark mud. "Is that all he's wearing down there?" the officer asked. "Keep digging and we'll find out," Thomas said. And so the officers continued digging carefully around the socks, slowly working their way up the mound and removing handfuls of dirt one by one. And pretty soon the full shape of a body emerged from the dirt. And the officers just stood there staring down into the hole, completely baffled by what they were seeing. Because this was clearly a young man, but his body had been forced into a highly unusual and specific position before the dirt was thrown over him. He was buried in a bizarre kneeling position, almost as if he had been shoved downward into a hole that was dug far too small for him. And his hands and his feet were securely bound with thick, tightly knotted cords. But that wasn't even the most jarring detail of the scene. Because as the officers finished clearing the heavy mud away from his body, they realized he was completely naked. And the absolute only piece of clothing he had on his entire body was that single pair of bright pink socks. TXT plus 4. Now the police carefully lifted the young man out of the grave, placed him into a heavy body bag, and transported him back to the local morgue for a full autopsy. And the pathologist who examined him on the metal table was able to determine a few key facts right away. Based on the condition of the remains and the specific composition of the soil around him, the pathologist concluded that this man had been buried at the Flint Mill for roughly 9 to 12 months. And even though the body was badly decomposed from being in the ground for nearly a full year, they could clearly see the exact cause of death. The young man had been violently strangled. But despite the highly violent nature of his death and the tight bindings on his wrists and ankles, his skull was completely intact. And this specific detail, the perfectly intact skull, would eventually prompt the local media to give the unidentified victim the nickname Fred the Head. TXT plus 3. So the local detectives gathered in their busy squad room the next morning, and they actually felt pretty confident that they were going to solve this case quickly. And their confidence came from a very specific piece of physical evidence that the pathologist had highlighted. During the autopsy, the pathologist noted that the young man had an extensive and highly unique set of dental records. He had very specific, intricate upper jaw work done. It wasn't just a simple filling or a basic extraction. It was a complex series of restorations that would have required multiple, lengthy visits to a highly skilled specialist. And back in 1971, this kind of specialized dental work was not cheap, and it certainly wasn't common among the general public. So the detectives figured that all they had to do was show these exact dental records to practicing dentists in the region. And surely the dentist who performed this complex upper jaw work would recognize it immediately, pull their patient files, and give the detectives the young man's full name. TXT plus 1. And so the police printed out hundreds of copies of the dental charts, and they sent uniformed officers out to knock on the doors of every single dental clinic in Staffordshire and the surrounding counties. And they asked every dentist they could find to review the files and check their active patient logs. But day after day, the officers came back to the station entirely empty-handed. Every dentist they spoke to looked at the charts, shook their heads, and said they had never seen work quite like that in their entire careers. And so the detectives decided to aggressively expand their search parameters. They sent the dental records out to major clinics across the entire United Kingdom, but again, they got absolutely zero matches. Now, this was incredibly frustrating for the investigators, because they had a victim with a perfectly intact skull, highly unique dental work, and a very specific physical profile. And yet, absolutely nobody seemed to be looking for him. And so they started systematically combing through the National Missing Persons database. They looked for any young man reported missing in the last year who matched the general physical description. And they actually found a few potential matches that looked promising on paper. And one case in particular seemed extremely likely to be their guy. A woman from a neighboring town came into the police station claiming that her son had gone missing about 10 months ago after an argument. And so the detectives brought her into a quiet interview room and offered her a cup of hot tea to calm her nerves. And they gently asked her questions about her missing son's daily habits, his close friends, and his preferred clothing. And she mentioned that he was fond of wearing brightly colored socks with his heavy leather work boots. So the detectives felt a massive surge of hope. They thought they had finally found Fred the Head's real identity. But when they cross-referenced her missing son's medical files with the autopsy report, the dental records quickly proved it was definitively not her son. And she left the station in tears, leaving the detectives right back at square one. But the police didn't give up there. They decided to look heavily into the pink socks. Because if the dental records weren't leading anywhere, maybe the clothing would provide a solid clue. The socks were brightly colored and distinct, so the detectives visited local textile mills and clothing shops to see if anyone recognized the brand or the specific dye used in the fabric. They spent weeks interviewing shop owners and factory workers, hoping that someone would remember selling a pair of bright pink socks to a young man in the last year. But pink socks were surprisingly common in certain fashion circles at the time, and without a specific manufacturer's tag tracing them, proved completely impossible. So another major lead just completely evaporated into thin air. And so months turned into years. And the original detectives working the case of Fred the Head eventually retired, passing the files on to the next generation of officers. But the local police refused to just let the case go and collect dust. And over the next 5 decades, different teams of investigators would periodically reopen the file and use whatever new technology was available to try and finally identify him. In the 1990s, they brought in specialized forensic anthropologists to take another look at the preserved physical evidence. And these experts used the perfectly intact skull to meticulously measure the cheekbones and the jawline. They placed tiny depth markers all over the bone structure to determine exactly how thick the facial muscles would have been. And then they carefully layered the clay on top, smoothing out the features to build a physical clay model of what the young man would have looked like when he was alive. They photographed this intricate facial reconstruction, and they broadcast it on national television, putting his face on the evening news across the country. And they waited for the phones in the precinct to ring, but the phone never rang. TXT. And then, as forensic technology advanced even further into the new millennium, the police decided to try something else. They went back into the deep storage evidence lockers and they successfully extracted the victim's DNA from the preserved remains. And they ran this newly sequenced DNA through multiple modern databases. And they figured that with millions of people globally submitting their DNA to commercial databases for ancestry purposes, surely they would find a distant relative. Someone who shared a genetic link and could finally give them a family name to work with. But the database searches came back completely blank, offering no familial connections whatsoever. TXT plus 1. So the current detectives find themselves sitting in the exact same interview room as their predecessors, looking at the exact same case file. And they spread the photos out on the table. There is the modern facial reconstruction. There is the original crime scene photo of the pink socks. There is the detailed list of extensive upper jaw dental work. And they just stare at the file, completely overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of the situation. They have all the physical evidence they could ever realistically ask for in a cold case. They have an intact skull, multiple modern DNA extractions, and highly specific expensive dental records. And they have the very specific and bizarre visual of a victim buried completely naked except for pink socks in a kneeling position. TXT plus 4. But despite all of this undeniable hard physical evidence, the man is a total ghost. It makes absolutely no logical sense that someone could afford such expensive and specific dental work go completely missing and leave absolutely no trace in any public record or family memory for over half a century. And the escalation of this mystery just continues to grow to this very day. Because every time a new detective takes over the cold case desk, they pull the thick file for Fred the Head. They review the tight bindings on his hands and feet. They look at the photos of the shallow grave by the abandoned flint mill, and they ask the exact same questions that were asked back in 1971. TXT. Who is he? And who strangled him? And why did they bury him in a kneeling position wearing absolutely nothing but pink socks? And they bring in new experts to try yet another modern facial reconstruction, hoping that a slightly different angle might finally trigger someone's memory. And they run the DNA extraction one more time, hoping that maybe the database has recently updated with a new relative. But every single time they try, the result is exactly the same. The man remains completely unidentified. TXT plus 2. And as of today, despite having extensive dental records showing unique upper jaw work, multiple modern facial reconstructions, and continuous DNA extractions over the past 50 years, the victim has never been identified, and his killer has never been found. And to this day, they do not have an explanation for it. TXT. And while this community was left staring into a grave that offered no answers just a few months later and thousands of miles away, another community was about to realize that the answers they were given were completely impossible, and the official police conclusion made absolutely no physical sense. On the morning of May 24th, 1971, Ved Prakash Malhotra walked into the massive stone building of the State Bank of India in New Delhi. And as he stepped out of the sweltering, oppressive heat of the Indian summer and into the cool, heavily air-conditioned lobby, he adjusted his tie and nodded politely to the armed security guards standing by the doors. Now, Ved was not just any standard employee at this bank. He was the chief cashier. And in a country as massive and heavily populated as India, being the chief cashier at the main branch of the state bank meant you were basically the ultimate gatekeeper to the nation's central treasury. So he handled millions upon millions of rupees every single day. And he prided himself on being an incredibly meticulous, highly observant, and deeply cautious man. He had spent years working his way up the ranks to secure this prestigious position, and because the state bank handled so many high-level classified government transactions, Ved made it his absolute business to know the exact signatures, the personal habits, and even the specific voices of India's top politicians and leaders, and that included the Prime Minister herself, Indira Gandhi. Ved had heard her speak on the radio countless times. He had listened to her give formal addresses to the parliament, and he had even interacted with her office on official banking matters. So he knew her highly distinctive, authoritative voice and her specific manner of speaking perfectly. And Ved's job, despite its massive importance to the country, was usually very routine and completely predictable. He would sit in his office, review the heavy paper ledgers, authorize large commercial withdrawals, and ensure the physical cash in the main vault was perfectly balanced at the end of every single day. And so on this particular morning, he sat down at his large wooden desk, poured himself a cup of hot tea, and began sorting through the towering stacks of daily paperwork. The bank around him was buzzing with the usual comforting sounds of heavy typewriters clacking, bank tellers rapidly counting out paper bills, and customers quietly murmuring in the lobby outside his door. And for the first few hours of his shift, everything went exactly as it always did. But then, right around midday, the private telephone sitting on the corner of Ved's desk suddenly rang. Now, this was a direct, unlisted line, meaning it completely bypassed the bank's main switchboard and was exclusively used for highly sensitive or urgent internal business. So Ved put down his pen, picked up the heavy plastic receiver, and held it to his ear. "Hello, Malhotra speaking," he said. And the voice that came through the earpiece immediately made Ved sit up perfectly straight in his leather chair. It was a woman's voice, and she spoke with a very specific, crisp cadence and an authoritative, commanding tone that Ved recognized instantly. It was Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and she did not waste any time with standard pleasantries or small talk. She told Ved that the country was in the middle of a highly classified, off-the-books intelligence operation concerning the neighboring region of Bangladesh. And she said that for this secret, sensitive mission to succeed, she needed him to personally withdraw 6 million rupees in physical cash immediately. Now, 6 million rupees in 1971 was an absolutely astronomical amount of money. It was basically a small fortune that could fund a small city. But the Prime Minister's voice was completely calm, steady, and incredibly commanding over the crackling phone line. She told Ved that because this was a top-secret military intelligence mission, there could be no official paperwork filed right now. Instead, he was to take the cash, pack it into a secure, heavy trunk, and personally drive it to a specific rendezvous point in the city. There he would be met by a secret government courier, and she told him the courier would identify himself by saying the code word Bangladesh, and Ved was to reply with the code word India. And Ved, sitting in his quiet office holding the phone, didn't even hesitate or question the order for a second. Because India was currently heavily involved in a massive escalating political and military crisis over the border in Bangladesh, and rumors of covert military operations were splashed across the front pages of the newspapers every single day. So to Ved, this highly unusual request actually made total logical sense. It was a matter of extreme national security, and he was being called upon to serve his country. "Yes, Madam Prime Minister," right away Ved said. So Ved hung up the phone, and he immediately stood up from his desk. He walked out of his office and marched down the long marble corridor that led directly to the bank's main underground vault. Now, the main vault of the State Bank of India was basically an impenetrable fortress. It was protected by massive, thick steel doors that required multiple heavy keys and complex combinations to open. And typically, a cash withdrawal of this massive size would require days of advance notice. Huge stacks of triplicate forms and physical signatures from at least 3 different senior board members. But Ved was the chief cashier. He had the ultimate unquestioned authority on the vault floor. So, when he told the vault attendants to open the heavy steel doors and start pulling out thick bundles of cash, nobody questioned him. He instructed them to bring out the money in the largest available denominations. And the attendants quickly started stacking thick, heavy bundles of crisp, newly printed 100-rupee notes onto a rolling metal cart. And it took several minutes just to physically count and stack that much paper cash. Because 6 million rupees is not just a number on a balance sheet. It is a massive, incredibly heavy physical object. So Ved requisitioned a large reinforced steel trunk from the bank's secure storage room. And he and the attendants carefully packed the thousands of bills tightly into the trunk until it was completely packed to the brim. Then Ved locked the heavy brass latches on the trunk, grabbed the thick leather handle, and strained to lift the massive weight. He carried the heavy steel box out the secured back doors of the bank, and he loaded it into the trunk of a standard bank-issued vehicle. And then he got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove off into the crowded, chaotic streets of New Delhi. And as he navigated his car through the thick, sweltering midday traffic, his heart was pounding heavily in his chest. But he wasn't nervous about carrying a fortune in cash. Actually, he felt an enormous sense of professional pride. I mean, the prime minister of the entire country had personally chosen him out of everyone in the government banking sector to execute a logistical mission of the highest national importance. So he followed her specific instructions perfectly. He drove to the exact street corner in the city that she had specified over the phone. It was a busy, dusty intersection filled with rushing pedestrians, bicycles, and loud taxis. And so Ved pulled his car over to the curb, put the vehicle in park, and just waited with the engine running. He kept checking his rearview mirror, wondering what a secret government intelligence courier would actually look like. And a few minutes later, a tall, heavily built man wearing a very simple, unassuming button-down shirt and plain trousers walked right up to the passenger side of Ved's car. The man leaned down and looked through the open window. And he looked perfectly ordinary, like any other middle-class businessman on his lunch break. "Bangladesh," the man said. And Ved looked back at him and gave a firm nod. "India," Ved replied. So the man opened the passenger door and slid into the seat. He didn't introduce himself, and he didn't offer a handshake, but his real name was Rustam Sorab Nagarwala. And so Ved reached over into the back seat, grabbed the heavy steel trunk containing 6 million rupees and hauled it over the seat to hand it directly to the courier. Nagarwala took the massive box, placed it heavily on his lap, and gave Ved a brief nod of acknowledgement. Then Nagarwala simply opened the car door, stepped back out onto the busy sidewalk, and hailed a passing taxi. He threw the heavy trunk into the back of the cab, climbed in, and the taxi just drove away. Instantly, blending in and completely disappearing into the endless stream of city traffic. And Ved just sat there in his idling car by the curb for a moment, taking a deep breath. The mission was complete. He had done his duty for his country. So he put his car in gear and he drove back to the State Bank of India. But as he sat back down at his desk and looked at the glaringly empty space in his master vault ledger, his meticulous banking nature started to aggressively kick in. He knew the Prime Minister had explicitly said this was an off-the-books operation, but Ved was a career banker who had spent decades following strict financial rules. He simply could not leave a 6 million rupee hole in the State Bank's daily accounting without at least a simple piece of paper. Even a highly classified handwritten receipt would do just to balance his personal files in case of an audit. So he decided to just drive over to the Prime Minister's official residence to secure a quick, quiet signature from her staff. When he arrived at the heavily guarded iron gates of the Prime Minister's estate, he showed his top-level bank credentials to the military guards and asked to speak directly to her chief secretary. He was escorted through the security checkpoint and into a quiet, formal waiting room inside the main building. And a few minutes later, one of the Prime Minister's top aides walked into the room. Ved stood up, smiled politely, lowered his voice to a whisper, and explained that he was just there to get a quick signature for the 6 million rupees he had just delivered for the classified Bangladesh mission. And the aide just stared at him with a completely blank, confused expression. The aide said he had absolutely no idea what Ved was talking about. The Prime Minister had not authorized any secret cash withdrawals from the State Bank. And more importantly, the Prime Minister hadn't made any phone calls to the State Bank of India that day. She hadn't spoken to Ved at all. And right then, all the color completely drained from Ved's face. His stomach dropped like a heavy stone, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Because he suddenly realized that the voice on the private phone, the specific pitch, the unique cadence, the authoritative tone he had trusted implicitly, was a flawless, unbelievable vocal impersonation. He had literally just handed 6 million rupees in physical cash directly from the National Treasury to a complete stranger on a street corner based entirely on a fake phone call. Ved immediately turned and ran out of the building, found the nearest public telephone on the street, and called the New Delhi police headquarters in an absolute panic. And when the lead police investigator heard the chief cashier of the State Bank stammering that 6 million rupees had basically just walked out the front door, he mobilized the entire police force within minutes. This lead investigator was a highly experienced, hardened detective who did not waste time. And he immediately threw up barricades and roadblocks across the entire city, dispatched armed units to every single taxi stand, bus terminal, and train station in New Delhi, and launched a massive, frantic, citywide manhunt. And remarkably, the aggressive police work paid off almost instantly. Within just a few hours of the drop-off, the lead investigator and his team tracked down the specific taxi driver who had picked up the courier at the intersection. The driver pointed them to a local, unassuming guest house on the edge of town. And the heavily armed police kicked the door in and found Rustam Sohrab Nagarwala sitting calmly on a bed in the room. And sitting right next to him on the floor was the heavy steel trunk, still containing almost all of the 6 million rupees. The lead investigator slapped the heavy metal handcuffs on Nagarwala's wrists and hauled him directly into the main police station. Now at this point, the New Delhi police felt like they had just wrapped up the fastest, most successful bank heist investigation in the city's entire history. And they threw Nagarwala into a sparse interrogation room and demanded to know exactly how he pulled it off. Nagarwala, sitting under the bright lights of the interrogation room, just shrugged his shoulders and completely confessed to the entire crime. He calmly explained that he was a former military man who just happened to be incredibly talented at mimicking people's voices. He claimed he acted entirely alone and had no accomplices. He said he simply found the bank's unlisted number called the chief cashier, put on his absolute best Indira Gandhi impression, and walked away with a fortune. It was just a brilliant, incredibly low-tech con. And to prove it, he even demonstrated the Prime Minister's voice right there in the interrogation room, perfectly matching her tone and inflection. And so, the police typed up the formal confession, recovered the stolen money, and officially charged him with criminal fraud. It seemed like an incredibly simple open and shut case. A bold, overconfident criminal who pulled off a massive stunt and got caught just hours after committing the perfect crime. But within a few days, the lead police investigator started noticing strange procedural things that just didn't add up. First of all, the legal proceedings against Nagarwala moved with a speed that was completely unheard of in the typically slow Indian justice system. Within just 3 days of his arrest, Nagarwala was formally tried, convicted, and sentenced to 4 years in a high-security prison. There was almost no real cross-examination in the courtroom, no deep dive into his personal military background, and absolutely no investigation into how he actually knew the highly specific internal protocols of the state banks. Direct, private, phone lines. And the lead investigator simply couldn't let it go. He was a veteran detective who trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him that this official story was full of massive holes. He kept digging quietly on his own time, wondering how a random, unconnected guy, acting entirely alone, could orchestrate something so incredibly precise. He wanted to know how Nagarwala knew that the chief cashier would have the unilateral authority to bypass the vault's strict security protocols without raising any alarms. But before the investigator could officially request to reopen the case file, present his new findings to a judge, and pull Nagarwala out of his prison cell for a second, much more intense round of questioning, the scope of this seemingly simple bank fraud suddenly exploded into something much darker. In early 1972, while sitting in his heavily guarded prison cell serving his sentence, Rustam Sohrab Nagarwala suddenly collapsed onto the concrete floor. The prison guards heard the heavy thud and rushed into the cell, but by the time the prison doctor arrived with medical equipment, Nagarwala was already dead. Now, the official medical report released by the prison authorities stated that Nagarwala had simply died of a sudden, massive heart attack. But the timing of his death was incredibly suspicious. Because in the weeks leading up to his sudden collapse, Nagarwala had been secretly writing letters to investigative journalists from his cell. And in these smuggled letters, he claimed that he had much more to say about the 6 million rupees, and that the official story of a lone fraudster was a complete lie. And as rumors began to swirl wildly around New Delhi that Nagarwala had been intentionally poisoned or silenced to protect powerful people, the lead police investigator who had originally arrested him refused to back down. He continued to quietly poke around the edges of the closed case. He started actively looking into the origin of the 6 million rupees and asking dangerous questions that powerful political figures clearly did not want answered. And then just a few months after Nagarwala dropped dead in his prison cell, this lead police investigator was driving his car down a local highway. It was a perfectly clear day. The roads were completely dry, and he was known by everyone in the department to be a very careful, highly experienced driver. But suddenly, another vehicle swerved violently and inexplicably into his lane at high speed, causing a massive catastrophic collision. The investigator's car was completely crushed into a mangled wreck of twisted metal and shattered glass, and the lead investigator was killed instantly. And when the news of the investigator's fatal, violent crash hit the papers the next morning, the entire country realized that Ved Prakash Malhotra had not just been duped by a simple low-tech bank robber with a knack for voice. Impression. The sheer scale of the ensuing violence and the perfectly timed deaths proved that Ved had unwittingly stumbled into a massive, deadly, high-level political conspiracy. Because an ordinary run-of-the-mill fraudster doesn't cause the primary suspect and the lead detective to both turn up dead under highly suspicious circumstances within months of each other. Following the deaths, massive national conspiracy theories erupted across India and dominated the news cycle for years. Many politicians and prominent journalists publicly claimed that Nagarwala was never a lone scammer at all. They theorized that he was actually a highly trained government intelligence operative and that the 6 million rupees was not stolen money, but rather an off-the-books political slush fund meant to finance covert military operations that had somehow gone terribly wrong. They widely believed Nagarwala and the investigator were systematically eliminated to cover up the existence of this secret fund and protect the people who controlled it. But despite multiple official government inquiries and decades of relentless public demand for answers, no one was ever officially charged in connection with the sudden deaths of Nagarwala or the lead investigator. And Ved Prakash Malhotra, the careful, meticulous man who answered the phone that morning, was quietly dismissed from his prestigious job at the bank, forced to live the rest of his life, knowing he had handed over an absolute fortune to a ghost. And to this day, the true original purpose of the 6 million rupees and the actual identities of the powerful people who silenced the men who knew the truth remain completely unknown. And while Ved Prakash Malhotra survived his encounter with a massive conspiracy that made absolutely no logical sense just a few months later, and on the other side of the world, a police department would be handed a murder confession that made absolutely no physical sense. On the morning of December 31st, 1971, 42-year-old Luis Banchero Rossi sat at the heavy mahogany desk in his corporate headquarters in Lima, Peru. And he was looking over a massive stack of financial ledgers that detailed the profits of his global empire. Because Luis was not just a successful businessman. He was the absolute wealthiest and most powerful man in the entire country. He had grown up incredibly poor in a small southern province, selling wine out of the back of a truck just to survive. But over the last 20 years, he had aggressively built a massive fortune in the fish meal industry. So he now owned fleets of commercial fishing vessels, giant industrial processing factories, multiple national newspapers, and a professional football club. And because of his enormous wealth and his cutthroat reputation in the boardroom, Luis was constantly surrounded by people who either wanted his money or wanted his power. So he was used to having eyes on him at all times, and he practically lived his life under a microscope. But despite his very public and aggressive corporate persona, Luis actually really valued his privacy when he was not actively working. And that is exactly why he had purchased a sprawling, highly secluded country estate in a place called Chaclacayo. Now, Chaclacayo was an exclusive, quiet mountain retreat located about an hour outside of the heavy gray smog of Lima. And it was where the absolute wealthiest politicians and executives went to escape the endless noise of the capital city. So Luis had specifically chosen this property because it was surrounded by incredibly high stone walls and heavy iron gates that completely cut it off from the outside world. And he was looking forward to driving out there that afternoon to spend a very quiet, isolated New Year's Eve away from the chaotic parties in the city. And when Luis finally packed up his briefcase and walked out of his corporate office, he was escorted by his personal bodyguards to his expensive imported car. But he told his security team that he would be driving up to the country estate alone. He wanted complete solitude for the holiday. So he drove his car up the winding, dusty mountain roads, leaving the heavy traffic of Lima far behind him. And when he eventually pulled up to the massive iron gates of his estate in Chaclacayo, the gates were manually opened by his groundskeeper. Luis slowly drove his car up the long gravel driveway, passing through the beautifully manicured gardens that surrounded the main house. And as he parked his car, he walked past the servants' quarters, located on the edge of the property. The head gardener lived in this small building with his family, and working right alongside the gardener was his 20-year-old son, Juan Vilca. Now, Juan was a very quiet, incredibly unassuming young man who essentially just stayed out of the way, and he was also a very small, incredibly frail person. He stood barely 5 feet tall, and his arms were thin and wiry from just doing light pruning and watering around the garden. So he had absolutely no physical presence, and he always kept his head down and his eyes fixed firmly on the dirt whenever the billionaire walked past him. And Luis just gave the young man a brief nod before unlocking the heavy front door and stepping into the cool, air-conditioned foyer of his massive country home. And waiting for him inside the house was his personal secretary, Eugenia Cesarego. Eugenia was a highly efficient, meticulously organized woman who essentially managed every single aspect of Luis's incredibly complicated personal and professional life. She was one of the very few people on the planet who knew exactly where the billionaire was at any given moment, and she practically lived at the estate to ensure his daily schedule ran perfectly. But while they had a strictly professional relationship, there was always a slight unspoken tension between them, because Luis demanded absolute perfection from his entire staff, and he was known to have a very fiery temper if things were not done exactly to his specific standards. And Eugenia was constantly buckling under the immense crushing pressure of managing the affairs of a man who practically owned the entire country. But on this particular New Year's Eve, the house was mostly quiet. So Luis spent the evening making a few phone calls to his business partners, reviewing some final paperwork for the year, and then he simply retired to his massive master bedroom suite for the night. But the next morning, January 1st, 1972, the absolute quiet of the Chaclacayo estate was violently shattered. Sometime around midday, the local police department in the area received a completely frantic phone call from the estate, and the person on the other end of the line was screaming hysterically, saying that there was blood everywhere and that they needed officers and an ambulance at the Banchero residence immediately. So multiple police cruisers immediately turned on their sirens and sped up the winding mountain roads. They tore through the open iron gates of the estate, their tires kicking up heavy clouds of dust, and they screeched to a halt in the gravel driveway. And the lead investigators jumped out of their vehicles with their weapons drawn, sprinting up the stone pathway and kicking open the heavy front door of the main house. And the moment the police stepped into the foyer, they realized they were walking into an absolute nightmare. The inside of the sprawling luxury home was in total chaos. Heavy wooden chairs and tables were completely overturned and splintered into pieces. Expensive glass lamps and ceramic vases were shattered all over the expensive Persian rugs. And as the officers made their way carefully down the long, wide hallway toward the master suite, they saw thick, heavy smears of dark blood completely covering the white walls. And when they finally reached the open door of the master bedroom, they stopped dead in their tracks. Because there, lying on the floor in a massive, sprawling pool of blood, was the billionaire Luis Banchero Rossi, and he had been brutally beaten with a heavy, blunt object and stabbed multiple times in the chest and back. But the sheer amount of physical destruction inside the bedroom made one thing incredibly obvious to the police. Luis had not been quietly caught off guard while he was sleeping. He had woken up and engaged in a massive, violent, desperate struggle for his life, and his heavy hands were covered in deep defensive wounds and dark bruising, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had fought back furiously against whoever had broken into his room. So the police immediately radioed for backup and completely locked down the entire property. They ordered uniform officers to seal the heavy iron gates so that absolutely nobody could get in or out. And they started rounding up every single person who was physically present on the estate grounds, demanding to know exactly what had happened. And the very first person they pulled aside for questioning was Luis's personal secretary, Eugenia. Now, Eugenia was completely unhurt, but she was pacing back and forth in the living room, frantically wringing her hands and crying hysterically. And when the lead detective sat her down and asked her to explain exactly what she saw, her story immediately started to shift and fall apart. First, she claimed that she had been sound asleep in her bedroom on the completely opposite side of the house, and she insisted that she didn't hear a single thing until she woke up later in the morning and found the body. But the detective immediately pointed out that the physical struggle in the master bedroom would have been incredibly loud, easily loud enough to wake every single person in the house. So Eugenia quickly backtracked and completely changed her story. She said that actually, she did hear some loud crashing noises early in the morning, and she claimed that when she cracked her door open to peek into the hallway, she saw a group of strange masked men running down the corridor carrying heavy weapons. And the detectives just looked at each other, highly skeptical of this sudden, very convenient addition of a masked gang of intruders. Because the crime scene investigators had already checked the perimeter of the house, and there were absolutely no signs of forced entry on any of the exterior doors or the heavy glass windows. The high stone walls surrounding the estate were completely undisturbed, and the security alarms had never been triggered. So the police started to look very closely at the staff members who actually lived on the grounds, suspecting that this was an inside job. And they ordered all the servants, the maids, and the groundskeepers to line up tightly outside in the gravel driveway. And as the detectives slowly walked down the line, carefully inspecting everyone's hands, faces, and clothing for any signs of blood or defensive scratches, they stopped directly in front of the gardener's 20-year-old son, Juan Vilca. Juan was physically trembling from head to toe. He was sweating profusely despite the cool mountain air, and he kept aggressively looking away from the officers, completely unable to make eye contact. And so the lead detective firmly grabbed Juan by the arm, pulled him forcefully out of the lineup, and dragged him into a small, windowless side room inside the house for a private interrogation. And the detectives didn't even have to push Juan very hard to get him to talk. They sat him down in a hard wooden chair, leaned aggressively over the table, and demanded to know exactly what he was doing inside the main house that morning. And almost immediately, Juan broke down in heavy tears and confessed to the entire crime. He told the police that he had sneaked into the main house early that morning with the sole intention of robbing the billionaire. He said he knew Luis kept large amounts of petty cash hidden in his master bedroom. So he grabbed a heavy garden tool and a sharp kitchen knife, and he crept quietly into the suite. But he said Luis suddenly woke up and caught him in the act. And so to prevent the billionaire from calling the police and ruining his life, Juan said he blindly attacked him, beating him and stabbing him to death all by himself. "Did anyone else help you get inside the house?" the lead detective asked. "No, it was just me," Juan said, staring blankly at the floor. "You killed them all by yourself?" the detective asked. "Yes, I did it completely alone," Juan replied softly. So, the police were absolutely thrilled with this outcome. I mean, having the single wealthiest and most powerful man in the country brutally murdered in his bed is a massive political nightmare that could cost them their jobs. But within just a few hours of arriving at the bloody crime scene, they had a full, uncoerced, highly detailed confession from a disgruntled, greedy servant. It was the absolute perfect, clean resolution to a potentially disastrous situation. And so they slapped heavy metal handcuffs tightly onto Juan's thin wrists, marched him proudly past the growing crowds of local journalists who had gathered outside the iron gates, and threw him roughly into the back of a police cruiser. And the chief of police even gave a highly publicized press conference that exact same afternoon, boldly declaring to the entire nation that the tragic, shocking murder of Luis Banchero Rossi was simply a botched burglary carried out by a desperate young man. He assured the public that the killer was behind bars and that the case was completely closed. But as the initial shock wore off over the next few days, the relentless Peruvian press and the general public started looking very closely at the official police report. And they quickly realized that the police's entire conclusion was based on a foundational assumption that made absolutely no physical sense whatsoever. Because the journalists had gotten their hands on the leaked crime scene photos and the official coroner's autopsy report, and the photos clearly showed that the master bedroom was practically destroyed in a massive, prolonged physical fight. Heavy solid oak chairs were completely splintered into pieces. The thick blood spatter reached all the way up to the high ceiling. And Luis Banchero Rossi was an incredibly large, powerful, physically towering man. He was widely known for his robust, aggressive physical strength. And he was not the kind of man to simply surrender. And his autopsy proved that his knuckles were deeply bruised and swollen, proving that he had landed several heavy, devastating punches on whoever had attacked him. But then everyone looked at the official police mugshot of the confessed killer, Juan Vilca. And if you recall, Juan was a tiny, frail, rail-thin 20-year-old boy who stood barely 5 feet tall. He had absolutely no physical strength, zero combat training, and most importantly, when he was arrested at the scene just hours after the murder, he did not have a single defensive mark, bruise, or scratch anywhere on his face or body. So it became glaringly, undeniably obvious that the official police explanation was completely and totally physically impossible. There is absolutely no physical way in the universe that a tiny, fragile boy like Juan Vilca could have walked into that bedroom and easily beaten a towering, fiercely resisting billionaire to death in brutal hand-to-hand combat. without sustaining a single scratch himself. And so the public suddenly realized that the quiet gardener's son was nothing but a paid scapegoat. He had likely been given a small amount of money, or perhaps his vulnerable family had been heavily threatened, forcing him to take the absolute fall for a horrific crime he could not have possibly committed alone. And when independent investigators and journalists started aggressively pulling back the layers of this supposedly botched robbery, the true, terrifying scale of the crime finally began to emerge. They immediately looked back at Eugenia Cesarego, the highly efficient secretary who had suspiciously given multiple conflicting statements on the morning of the murder. They dug deeply into her personal financial records and discovered that she had quiet, deeply hidden ties to several of Luis Banchero Rossi's most aggressive corporate business rivals. These were incredibly powerful people who stood to easily make hundreds of millions of dollars if Luis was suddenly and violently removed from the global fish meal export market. And suddenly, this event wasn't a simple tragic home invasion anymore. This was a massive, highly coordinated, heavily funded political and corporate assassination. And wild theories immediately exploded across the entire country, dominating the front pages of every newspaper. Some investigative journalists boldly claimed that Luis was murdered by a shadowy syndicate of ex-Nazis who had quietly fled to South America after the Second World War and were now using hired mercenaries to seize total control of Peru's lucrative export economy. Others firmly believed that the Peruvian Secret Service had orchestrated the bloody hit because Luis was rapidly gaining too much political power and was secretly planning to heavily fund a rival opposition government. And the disturbing fact that the local police had so eagerly and quickly accepted a physically impossible confession only heavily fueled the widespread belief that the local authorities were actively participating in a massive, systemic cover-up to protect the real killers. And Juan Vilca was eventually officially convicted of murder, based entirely on his own impossible confession, and he was quietly sent away to a high-security prison to serve out his sentence. Eugenia Cesarego was also eventually formally convicted as an accomplice for her undeniable role in helping coordinate the killer's secret access to the heavily guarded estate, though she stubbornly never revealed exactly who those masked killers actually were. And despite the massive national outrage and the glaring physical impossibility of the official police story, the actual highly trained hit squad that physically overpowered the towering billionaire and the powerful wealthy masterminds who paid them to do it were never officially identified. And since January 1st, 1972, the true orchestrators of the murder of Luis Banchero Rossi have remained completely hidden, and to this day they do not have an explanation for it. And while a massive fortune and absolute power could not protect a billionaire from a heavily coordinated assassination just a few months later and thousands of miles away, an entire building full of everyday people would find themselves trapped in a deadly, inescapable situation, created entirely by corporate greed. On a warm Saturday evening in May of 1972, 22-year-old Yoko arrived at the massive Sen-Nichi department store building in the heart of Osaka, Japan. And as she walked through the bustling ground floor lobby, she adjusted her crisp white uniform and pinned her plastic name tag to her lapel. Now the Sen-Nichi building was not just a simple retail store. It was a massive, sprawling 7-story concrete entertainment complex that practically functioned as its own enclosed city. The ground floors were packed with high-end grocery stores and bustling retail counters. The middle floors housed dozens of boutique clothing shops, large furniture, showrooms, and even a fully functioning bowling alley. And all the way up on the top floor, the 7th floor, was the absolute crown jewel of the entire building, the Playtown Cabaret. So Yoko stepped into the large service elevator and pressed the button to ride all the way up to her shift, and she actually really loved her job as a hostess at the Playtown Cabaret. The pay was exceptionally good for a young woman in Osaka at the time, and she got to spend her weekends listening to fantastic live music and serving drinks to thousands of different people. But despite the glamorous atmosphere of the nightclub working in the Sen-Nichi building came with a very strict set of corporate rules. Because the building was so massive and structurally complex, the corporate management team was completely obsessed with loss prevention and maximizing their daily profits. And their biggest ongoing issue was petty theft. Teenagers and shoplifters would frequently steal items from the lower retail floors and then use the building's maze of concrete emergency stairwells to slip away completely unnoticed. And worse than that, management had recently discovered that large groups of young people were using these exact same emergency stairwells to sneak all the way up to the 7th floor. They would quietly slip into the Playtown Cabaret through the back fire doors, completely bypassing the expensive cover charge at the front entrance. And so, to completely put an end to this loss of revenue, the building's management team held a meeting and implemented a very aggressive, highly permanent security solution. They instructed their overnight maintenance staff to purchase dozens of thick, heavy steel chains and heavy-duty brass padlocks. And they had the staff physically wrap these heavy chains tightly around the metal handles of every single emergency exit door in the stairwells, and then they locked them completely shut. And to take their loss prevention even further, management hired construction crews to permanently brick over the lower halves of the large glass windows on the upper floors. And they bolted heavy iron security bars across the top sections of the glass. So they essentially turned the upper floors of the massive commercial building into a heavily fortified, inescapable vault just to save a few dollars on stolen merchandise and skipped cover charges. Now, when Yoko stepped out of the service elevator on the 7th floor that night, the Playtown Cabaret was absolutely packed. There were nearly 200 people inside the dimly lit club, crowded tightly around small circular tables and packed onto the wooden dance floor. And sitting near the center of the room was a 24-year-old local corporate accountant named Kenji. And Kenji was out celebrating a recent highly lucrative promotion at his firm with a large group of his close co-workers. He had just ordered a large round of expensive drinks for his entire table, and he was laughing loudly at a joke one of his friends had just told. The waiters in the club were rushing back and forth, carrying heavy metal trays filled with glassware. The live band on the stage was playing loud, upbeat pop songs, and the entire room was just buzzing with typical Saturday night energy. And for the first few hours of the evening, everything was perfectly normal and completely routine. But right around 10:30 that night, completely unbeknownst to anyone up in the loud nightclub, a very quiet problem was starting 4 floors below them. On the 3rd floor of the Sen Nichi building, there was a massive retail section that was entirely dedicated to women's fashion. And this floor was essentially a vast, open warehouse filled with hundreds of tightly packed metal clothing racks. And almost all of these racks were heavily loaded with dresses, skirts, and blouses made from cheap, highly flammable synthetic polyester materials. Now, the exact cause of the initial spark was never definitively proven by fire investigators, but a small flame suddenly ignited in a dark corner of the 3rd floor clothing department. And because the floor was completely deserted for the night, and the overhead lights were totally shut off, the fire grew in total, absolute silence. And it quickly jumped from one rack of polyester clothing to the next, consuming the synthetic fabrics at an incredibly rapid pace. And as these specific synthetic materials burned, they didn't just produce regular wood smoke. They produced an incredibly thick, black, highly toxic chemical smoke that was heavily saturated with carbon monoxide gas. And within just a matter of minutes, the entire 3rd floor was completely engulfed in a massive rolling inferno. The extreme physical heat of the flames actually shattered the large glass display windows on the 3rd floor, completely blowing the heavy glass panels out onto the street below. And this sudden massive influx of fresh oxygen from the broken windows acted like a giant bellows. It fed the roaring fire and pushed the thick, highly toxic smoke directly into the building's main ventilation system. And the building's large metal ventilation shafts essentially acted like massive vertical chimneys. They aggressively sucked the thick black smoke directly up through the interior walls, completely bypassing the 4th, 5th, and 6th floors entirely. And the system pumped this toxic smoke straight out of the air conditioning vents on the 7th floor directly into the Playtown Cabaret. Up on the seventh floor, Kenji was just picking up his glass to take another sip of his drink when he noticed a strange dark haze quickly gathering near the ceiling tiles. He blinked his eyes and looked up, and he saw thick, heavy black smoke pouring steadily out of the large rectangular metal grates directly above the dance floor. And at first, some of the patrons just pointed up at the vents, assuming it was some kind of strange theatrical special effect for the live band. But the smoke was pouring in incredibly fast, and it carried a sharp, bitter, burning chemical smell that immediately made Kenji's eyes water and his throat completely seize up. He dropped his glass onto the wooden table and stood up. "We have to leave," Kenji said. "What is going on?" his friend asked, coughing heavily. "Just grab your coat and move," Kenji said. And right at that exact moment, the building's main electrical grid physically failed due to the intense fire below. The loud live music abruptly cut off mid-note, and every single light in the massive nightclub instantly flickered and died, plunging the entire room into complete and absolute darkness. And instantly, the 200 people inside the club panicked. Heavy wooden chairs were knocked over, glasses shattered loudly on the wooden floor, and people began blindly shoving each other to get toward the main exit. Yoko, the young hostess, was standing near the back bar when the lights went out. And the toxic smoke was dropping so fast from the high ceiling that she had to physically drop to her hands and knees just to find a small pocket of breathable air near the floorboards. So a massive wave of coughing terrified people blindly pushed their way through the dark toward the main elevator bank. But when they got there and repeatedly pressed the plastic call buttons, the heavy metal elevator doors remained completely shut because the power to the building was completely dead. So the crowd violently shifted direction and surged toward the heavy metal doors that led to the emergency stairwells. Kenji was pushed forcefully along with the panicked crowd, keeping his head down and covering his mouth tightly with his suit jacket. He finally reached the front of the pack and he slammed his hands against the heavy steel push bar of the emergency exit door. He pushed with all of his physical strength, but the door did not budge a single inch. And as the toxic smoke severely burned his eyes, he reached down in the dark and his fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. He felt the thick, heavy metal chains and the massive brass padlocks that management had installed to prevent petty theft. They were completely locked inside. "The door won't open," a man yelled in the dark. "Help me push," Kenji said. So Kenji began violently kicking the heavy steel door with his leather shoes, and dozens of other patrons crowded tightly around him, desperately throwing their entire body weight against the door in a frantic attempt to break the heavy chain. But the solid brass padlocks held perfectly firm, and the chemical smoke inside the club was now so incredibly thick and toxic that people were simply collapsing onto the wooden floor. Now, typically when a massive fire breaks out in a commercial building, the actual flames are what people fear the most. But in reality, the smoke produced by burning synthetic materials like polyester is far more lethal. Because when you inhale thick carbon monoxide gas, it immediately binds to the hemoglobin in your blood completely, preventing your body from absorbing oxygen. And so, your limbs become incredibly heavy, your brain becomes highly confused, and you lose consciousness within just a few minutes, even if the actual fire is hundreds of feet away. Yoko crawled across the sticky floor toward the exterior wall of the building, hoping to find a window, and she felt the cool glass of a window pane and tried to push it open to get fresh air. But her hands hit the solid brickwork that covered the lower half, and her fingers slipped against the heavy iron bars bolted firmly across the top. There was absolutely no physical way to squeeze through. Out on the busy downtown streets, the Osaka Fire Department had dispatched dozens of heavy red fire engines to the Sennichi building within minutes of the first emergency call. But when the massive ladder trucks arrived, they encountered a massive logistical nightmare. The streets were heavily congested with weekend traffic and thousands of pedestrians who had stopped to watch the massive plumes of black smoke billowing into the night sky. And when the firefighters finally managed to deploy their heavy extension ladders, they quickly realized the ladders were physically too short to reach the 7th floor windows of the Playtown Cabaret. And inside the completely dark, toxic club, someone near the center of the room remembered the emergency rescue equipment. They felt their way along the wall until they found a large red glass case. They smashed the glass with a heavy wooden chair and pulled out a heavy canvas rescue chute. Now, this chute was essentially a long, reinforced fabric tube designed to be anchored to a window frame and dropped all the way down to the street below, theoretically allowing people to slide down the inside of the tube one at a time to safety. Several men managed to force open a small gap in one of the heavily barred windows, just wide enough to squeeze the canvas fabric through. And they secured the heavy metal anchor hooks to the interior wall and threw the rest of the long canvas tube out into the night air. And immediately, a frantic rush of desperate, suffocating people surged toward the tiny opening in the window. The canvas rescue chute was strictly engineered to safely support the physical weight of only one sliding human body at a single time. But in the pitch-black choking darkness with their lungs actively burning from the toxic synthetic smoke, nobody waited their turn. The patrons were in an absolute blind panic, and so 5, 10, and then almost 20 people blindly threw themselves into the narrow canvas opening at the exact same time. They piled heavily into the fabric tube, physically crushing each other as they frantically tried to slide down the material. And the heavy canvas fabric pulled extremely tight against the metal anchor hooks bolted to the wall. The physical weight of 20 adult bodies was simply too massive for the material to hold. And with a loud tearing sound, the reinforced canvas physically ripped completely apart. The long fabric tube completely split open straight down the side, and dozens of people simply fell through the torn fabric, plunging 7 stories straight down onto the hard concrete street, directly in front of the arriving firefighters. And back inside the completely sealed, smoke-filled room, the remaining patrons quickly realized the canvas chute had completely failed, and they were left with absolutely no other physical options. The heavy metal doors were completely padlocked shut. The exterior windows were heavily bricked and barred. And the toxic carbon monoxide continued to pour relentlessly out of the metal ventilation shafts. And so people simply stopped fighting, laid their heavy heads down on the floor, and quietly slipped into unconsciousness as the gas completely filled their lungs. By the time the local fire department finally managed to extinguish the massive blaze on the 3rd floor and physically cut through the heavy padlock chains in the stairwells with heavy hydraulic saws, they walked into an absolutely devastating scene on the 7th floor. The physical flames had never actually reached the Playtown Cabaret. The wooden dance floor and the small circular tables were completely unburned and totally intact. But lying across the floor, mostly piled up in massive, tangled mounds, right against the padlocked emergency exit doors, were the bodies of the patrons and the nightclub staff. In total, 118 people perished on the night of May 13th, 1972. And the medical examiners determined that almost every single victim died strictly from carbon monoxide poisoning. They were essentially suffocated inside a sealed concrete box, simply because corporate management had actively chosen to padlock the fire exits just to stop a few teenagers from sneaking in without paying a cover charge. Now, typically, when a massive building code violation is discovered after a tragedy, the corporate owners will try to blame a lower-level maintenance worker or a rogue manager. But the police investigators quickly recovered the original internal corporate memos signed by the top executives. These documents explicitly ordered the heavy chains, the brass padlocks, and the bricked windows. So there was absolutely no denying that this was a coordinated top-down corporate directive. And following this completely preventable disaster, the Japanese government was forced to institute massive, sweeping legal overhauls to their commercial building codes and their national fire safety regulations. And the top executives of the Sen Nichi department store were eventually dragged into criminal court and formally charged with professional negligence resulting in death. And to this day, they do not have an explanation for how anyone thought padlocking an emergency exit was a reasonable idea. And while an entire building full of everyday people found themselves trapped in a deadly, inescapable situation created entirely by corporate greed just a few months earlier, a glowing ring of soil left on a farm would completely defy the FANG, laws of natural earth science. On an early evening in November of 1971, 16-year-old Ronald Johnson was finishing up his daily agricultural chores on his family's isolated property in Delphos, Kansas. And working on a massive, highly demanding sheep farm was basically the only life Ronald had ever truly known. His parents, Arthur and Darrell, owned a sprawling, heavily wooded piece of land where they raised large herds of livestock and grew seasonal crops to sustain their livelihood. So Ronald spent almost all of his free time outside the classroom, physically tending to the animals and helping his father maintain the heavy farming equipment. He was a very pragmatic, deeply grounded kid who took an enormous amount of personal pride in being highly dependable for his family. But farm work in the American Midwest was incredibly demanding, back-breaking physical labor that required constant vigilance from everyone in the household. And the natural soil on their particular property in Delphos was notoriously rich and highly porous, making it excellent for agriculture, but difficult to navigate in bad weather. Whenever the heavy autumn rainstorms aggressively rolled through the county, the dirt in their sheep pens and surrounding grazing pastures would immediately absorb the heavy water deep into the ground. And it would rapidly turn into this incredibly thick, heavy mud that would violently stick to the bottom of Ronald's heavy leather work boots. So he was intimately used to trudging through damp, waterlogged earth for days, after a good storm constantly scraping the heavy, wet mud off his thick rubber soles before he stepped onto his mother's clean kitchen porch. Now, Ronald had a very specific, heavily regimented evening routine that he followed almost every single day without fail. Right around 6:30, as the bright sun was starting to slowly dip below the perfectly flat horizon, and the temperature was rapidly dropping, he would grab his tools and head out to the sheep pens near the edge of the dense, sprawling tree line. And his primary job was to manually ensure that all the sheep were properly secured for the cold night, and that their long wooden feeding troughs were completely filled with fresh grain. He would usually bring the family's small, highly energetic dog along with him for company and protection in the dark. And on this particular Tuesday evening, November 2nd, the weather was exceptionally clear, perfectly still, and incredibly quiet. So Ronald grabbed his heavy insulated winter jacket from the metal hook by the back door, called out loudly for the dog, and walked out into the crisp, freezing evening air. And he quickly made his way down the long, heavily rutted dirt path toward the primary animal enclosures. He could hear the large flock of sheep softly bleating in the distance, a sound that usually brought him a lot of comfort after a long day. He honestly just wanted to get this final tedious chore done as quickly as possible, because his absolute favorite local radio program was going to be broadcasting in about an hour, and he really wanted to be back inside where the heavy wood stove was burning warm. But as he finally approached the sturdy wooden fences of the main sheep pen, he immediately noticed that the animals were not behaving normally at all. Usually, when Ronald confidently walked up to the fence line carrying the heavy plastic buckets of fresh grain feed, the hungry sheep would immediately crowd aggressively around the wooden barrier, physically pushing heavily against each other to get access to the trough first. But tonight, the entire massive flock was huddled incredibly tightly together in the absolute farthest, darkest corner of the large pen. They were completely unnervingly silent, and they were all staring intensely and motionlessly toward a thick cluster of tall trees, located just a few dozen yards beyond the perimeter fence line. And the family dog, who usually ran aggressively right up to the fence to loudly bark at the sheep, suddenly stopped completely dead in its tracks on the dirt path. The dog tucked its tail firmly between its back legs, let out a very low whimper, and simply refused to take another physical step forward. And Ronald just stood there in the freezing cold, holding the two heavy feed buckets, desperately trying to figure out what had completely and thoroughly spooked his normally calm animals. He naturally figured there was probably just a stray, hungry coyote, or maybe a wild, aggressive dog quietly moving around in the thick brush near the dark tree line. So he slowly set the heavy grain buckets down on the cold dirt, and he took a few very cautious, quiet steps toward the towering trees, hoping to simply yell and scare off whatever dangerous predator was lurking out there in the dark. He reached down and picked up a solid, heavy wooden branch from the cold ground to use as a makeshift defensive club, just in case the unseen animal decided to suddenly charge out of the darkness directly at him. But as Ronald slowly walked past the absolute edge of the wooden sheep pen and physically moved closer to the dark, intimidating cluster of trees, he suddenly heard a very strange, unnatural noise. It was an incredibly low, heavy, steady rumbling sound that literally seemed to vibrate aggressively right through the thick rubber soles of his heavy work boots. And at first, Ronald naturally assumed it was just his father manually starting up one of the heavy diesel-powered tractors in the nearby metal storage barn, because that low, rhythmic mechanical hum sounded almost exactly like a massive agricultural engine idling heavily in the cold air. So he slightly lowered the heavy wooden branch and noticeably relaxed, his tense shoulders reasonably, figuring his hard-working dad was just putting in some late hours on the farm equipment. But then the steady rumbling sound begins to aggressively and continuously increase in physical volume and intense pitch. It rapidly shifts from a low, manageable mechanical hum to an incredibly high-pitched, violently vibrating whine that physically hurts Ronald's sensitive eardrums. And he suddenly realizes the deafening sound is absolutely not coming from the metal storage barn located far behind him. It is aggressively emanating directly from the incredibly dark, thick cluster of trees located right in front of him. So he takes another few hesitant, extremely cautious steps forward and forcefully pushes past a thick line of heavy, overgrown bushes. And when he physically steps into the small, secluded clearing among the tall trees, his breath violently catches in his dry throat, and his entire body completely freezes in place. Hovering perfectly steadily, just about 2 feet above the damp, porous farm soil, is a massive, impossibly smooth metallic object. It is roughly 9 feet tall and maybe 10 feet across, physically shaped almost exactly like a massive inverted mushroom. And its entire smooth metallic surface is completely covered in a shockingly bright, intensely pulsating, multicolored light that completely and thoroughly illuminates the surrounding dark tree trunks. The massive object is totally, completely silent, aside from that intensely painful, high-pitched, vibrating whine. And it is just hovering perfectly, impossibly still in the cold night air, continuously casting a heavy, deeply unnatural and strange glow across the entirety of the small, secluded clearing. Now, Ronald is a very practical, highly experienced farm kid who confidently knows every single piece of heavy agricultural machinery operating in the entire county. But he has absolutely zero frame of reference or logical explanation for what he is currently looking at. He just stands there completely helplessly paralyzed, gripping the heavy wooden branch tightly in his sweating hand, helplessly watching the intensely bright lights rapidly shift from a deep bloody red to a bright, brilliant, blinding blue. And then, completely without any physical warning or shifting gears, the high-pitched, vibrating whine suddenly pitches violently up into an absolute ear-piercing, unearthly shriek. The massive metallic object tilts very slightly to one physical side. And then it completely blasts off vertically into the dark night sky with an absolutely unbelievable, impossible burst of physical speed. And the sudden, violent vertical acceleration immediately generates a massive, overwhelmingly blinding flash of pure, intense white light. Ronald immediately drops his heavy wooden branch and violently throws both of his bare hands up tightly over his face, audibly crying out in intense physical pain, as the extreme flash completely and violently overwhelms his sensitive retinas. For several long seconds, he is totally functionally blind, seeing absolutely nothing but massive, bright purple spots aggressively swimming in front of his damaged eyes. He stumbles violently backward in the dark, physically tripping over his own heavy boots and falling incredibly heavily onto the damp, freezing farm soil. He can violently feel his own heart pounding wildly and aggressively in his tight chest as he frantically and desperately rubs at his heavily watering eyes, desperately trying to manually clear his blocked vision. And when his damaged eyesight finally begins to slowly and painfully return to normal, He looks directly back up at the freezing night sky. But the massive, glowing metallic object is entirely gone, leaving absolutely nothing but the quiet, incredibly empty darkness hovering above the rural farm. Ronald frantically scrambles back to his feet, absolutely and thoroughly in a state of pure shock for his physical life, and he takes off running as fast as his heavy boots can physically carry him directly back toward the safety of the main house. He completely and totally ignores the severely frightened sheep and the heavy grain buckets he had left completely abandoned in the dirt. He sprints aggressively up the wooden steps of the back porch, violently throws open the wooden screen door, and practically physically collapses into the bright, incredibly warm kitchen where his parents are quietly sitting at the table. Arthur and Darrell looked up in absolute unadulterated shock as their oldest son stumbled violently into the quiet room. Ronald was physically, visibly shaking uncontrollably from head to toe. His face was completely ghost-like. Pale and heavy tears were streaming rapidly down his dirty cheeks from his severely irritated, violently red eyes. He was aggressively gasping for air, desperately struggling to physically form a single coherent sentence. "What in the world is wrong with you?" Arthur asked. "There is something out by the trees," Ronald said, hyperventilating heavily. "What exactly are you talking about?" Darrell asked, standing up quickly. "You have to come outside and look, right now," Ronald replied, grabbing the table. And at first, Arthur and Darrell honestly and logically thought their teenage son was just aggressively playing some highly elaborate, overly dramatic practical joke on them. Because Ronald was widely known to occasionally mess around and actively try to heavily spook his younger siblings in the dark. But as Arthur looked much closer at his trembling son, he clearly saw the genuine, absolute, unadulterated physical panic heavily present in Ronald's wide eyes. And he specifically saw that Ronald's dark pupils were completely and impossibly constricted, physically reacting exactly as if he had just stared completely directly into an incredibly bright burning welding torch. And so Arthur immediately and decisively grabbed a heavy metal industrial flashlight from the kitchen counter, aggressively pulled on his heavy leather boots, and physically followed his panicked son right back out the back door. Darrell followed very closely and carefully behind them, as Ronald nervously led his parents directly past the completely silent sheep pens and strictly toward that specific dark cluster of towering trees. And as they finally approached the absolute edge of the small clearing, Arthur decisively clicked on his incredibly heavy bright flashlight, fully and completely expecting to finally see a wandering trespasser, or maybe a heavy piece of crashed, broken farm machinery. But he didn't even physically need the bright flashlight, because as they slowly and cautiously stepped directly through the heavy, overgrown bushes, the three of them immediately and simultaneously saw a bright, intensely glowing ring, perfectly illuminated on the dark ground right exactly where the massive object had been quietly hovering. The glowing ring was perfectly geometrically circular, completely and utterly symmetrical, and continuously glowing with an incredibly strange, pale, unnatural luminescence in the pitch dark. It looked physically almost exactly like someone had intentionally and carefully poured a thick, heavy ring of glowing, intensely radioactive liquid directly onto the porous farm soil. And the physical air absolutely inside the small clearing felt incredibly and noticeably strange. It was noticeably physically warmer than the absolute rest of the freezing farm, and it heavily carried a sharp, deeply bitter, highly ozone-like chemical smell, physically very similar to the thick charged air left right immediately. After a massive, incredibly close lightning strike, Arthur very cautiously stepped much closer to the glowing ring and aggressively shined his heavy flashlight directly onto it. And he clearly saw that the unnatural light absolutely wasn't physically coming from some kind of thick liquid or luminescent paint. The highly porous farm soil itself was actually physically glowing from within. So Arthur slowly knelt down on the freezing ground, and he incredibly carefully reached his bare, calloused hand out to directly touch the heavily illuminated dirt. But the exact precise moment his bare fingers lightly brushed against the glowing soil, he felt a sharp, incredibly intense, vibrating numbness completely and violently shoot directly up his arm. It physically felt exactly like aggressively grabbing a highly charged live electrical wire. He immediately and violently jerked his hand backward in extreme physical shock, rapidly rubbing his numb fingers aggressively together as the strange, heavily vibrating numb sensation slowly and painfully faded away. And Durrell, who was quietly and nervously watching her husband physically react to the glowing soil, tentatively stepped forward and actually physically touched the illuminated dirt herself. And she immediately experienced the exact precise same, violently vibrating, deeply electrical numbness, intensely present in her own fingers. They both stood completely up and nervously backed heavily away from the glowing ring, completely and utterly baffled by what they were physically seeing and physically feeling. Arthur intimately knew every single inch of his sprawling farm, and he heavily knew that porous Kansas soil simply did not naturally glow brightly in the pitch dark, and it definitively did not aggressively electrocute you. So he turned directly to his wife and firmly told her to physically go straight back to the warm house and immediately call the local county authorities. About an incredibly tense hour later, Sheriff Ralph Enlow from the local Ottawa County Sheriff's Office pulled his incredibly heavy marked police cruiser directly into the long dirt driveway of the isolated Johnson farm. And Sheriff Enlow was a very highly seasoned, incredibly practical, local lawman who had successfully dealt with just about every single kind of rural property dispute and heavy farm accident physically imaginable. So when the local dispatch explicitly told him a family was actively reporting a glowing UFO ring actively present on their physical property, he fully and completely expected to immediately arrive and find a smoldering, dangerous brush fire, or maybe just some local teenage kids aggressively pulling a heavy, elaborate prank with brightly burning chemical flares. But when Arthur and a still highly shaken Ronald physically led the skeptical sheriff directly out to the dark clearing and collectively shined their heavy flashlights down onto the ground, Sheriff Enlow very quickly and decisively realized this was absolutely no teenage prank. The highly pale, glowing luminescent ring was still very clearly and unnaturally visible, physically present in the incredibly dark, porous farm soil. And when the highly experienced sheriff incredibly carefully touched the illuminated dirt himself, he officially and fully documented the exact, precise, same strange, heavily vibrating electrical numbness that the entire family had accurately reported. He diligently spent over an incredibly long, tedious hour meticulously and physically walking the entire perimeter of the dark clearing, aggressively looking for absolutely any deep tire tracks, heavy boot footprints, or physical signs of heavy industrial machinery that could have possibly been used to physically fake the glowing ring. But he found absolutely and completely nothing. And the intensely surrounding tightly packed trees were completely and thoroughly undisturbed physically, meaning absolutely no heavy equipment had been forcefully driven into the small, secluded clearing. The incredibly glowing ring was just perfectly sitting there, completely and impossibly physically isolated from the rest of the world. So Sheriff Enlow meticulously took several detailed, high-contrast photographs of the glowing soil, carefully wrote down incredibly detailed, highly specific official statements from the entire physically shaken family, and formally filed a highly detailed official incident report. But he honestly and truthfully had absolutely zero logical or practical explanation for what he was physically looking at. And over the incredibly tense next few days, the intensely pale, unnatural glow incredibly slowly faded entirely away from the soil until the massive ring just physically looked like a perfectly circular, completely undisturbed patch of pale, incredibly ashy dirt. Now, normally and traditionally, in incredibly strange, isolated rural cases involving strange, unexplainable lights in the dark sky or incredibly bizarre, confusing farm encounters, the official story basically and conclusively ends right. Exactly there. The highly shaken witnesses formally give their detailed statements. The baffled local authorities officially shrug their broad shoulders. And everyone slowly and quietly moves on with their daily lives, because there is absolutely no permanent, lasting physical evidence to scientifically analyze. But the incredibly strange, highly documented situation actively developing on the Johnson farm in Delphos was about to actively take a massive, completely unprecedented historical turn. Because while the incredibly mysterious pale glow had completely and entirely faded permanently away, the basic physical properties of the porous soil entirely inside that perfectly circular ring had been fundamentally, physically, and permanently altered. And the highly practical family only physically discovered this completely impossible fact a few freezing weeks later, when the incredibly harsh, brutal Midwestern winter finally and aggressively set in. A massive, incredibly violent winter snowstorm heavily dumped several thick inches of incredibly heavy, intensely wet snow across the entire rural county. And when the incredibly heavy snow eventually and slowly melted, the Johnsons' massive, sprawling property violently turned into a massive, incredibly deep, muddy swamp. The highly porous natural Kansas dirt aggressively and completely absorbed all the heavy melted snow, physically creating incredibly deep, dark puddles and incredibly thick, heavy mud everywhere on the entire farm. But as Arthur was physically walking directly past the dark clearing to manually check on the freezing sheep, he immediately noticed something completely and physically impossible. The perfectly, flawlessly circular ring of ashy soil, strictly where the massive object had physically hovered, was completely, remarkably, and impossibly dry. The incredibly heavy, thoroughly wet snow had completely melted everywhere else in the entire clearing, heavily saturating the porous ground. But the dirt, specifically entirely inside the physical ring, had absolutely not physically absorbed a single solitary drop of liquid moisture. It physically looked exactly like perfectly bone-dry ash, sitting perfectly, completely undisturbed, right exactly in the physical middle of a massive, heavily saturated, muddy swamp. And Arthur just stood there and stared directly at it, completely and thoroughly, utterly confused, because he heavily and intimately knew exactly how highly porous the natural dirt actively on his physical property truly was. It was absolutely, conclusively, scientifically impossible for a specific patch of farm soil to completely remain perfectly dry after a massive, incredibly heavy snowmelt. So Arthur physically walked directly back to the main metal barn, aggressively grabbed a highly heavy galvanized metal bucket, and physically filled it completely directly to the brim with heavy freezing water strictly from the farm hose. He physically carried the incredibly heavy sloshing bucket directly out to the dark clearing and physically stood directly over the strange, completely ashy ring. And then he aggressively tilted the heavy bucket and forcefully poured all the heavy freezing water directly onto the pale patch of dirt. But the heavy water absolutely did not physically soak directly in. Instead, it immediately and aggressively beaded completely up on the dirt's surface and violently and physically rolled right exactly off the dry dirt, physically acting exactly as if he had just aggressively poured heavy water directly onto a slick sheet of heavy industrial greased plastic. The soil completely and violently repelled the physical moisture. And as the incredible news of this highly bizarre, completely physically impossible ring slowly spread, highly trained independent researchers and strictly professional scientists, physically from the Center for UFO Studies, actively descended directly on the small isolated farm exactly in Kansas. They aggressively brought incredibly heavy, highly specialized digging equipment and completely portable, highly advanced laboratory kits, completely determined to actively find a strictly rational, completely earthly explanation for the highly strange physical phenomenon. And the incredibly first thing the trained researchers actively did was physically completely dig out incredibly large, highly heavy chunks of the strange, dry soil directly from the ring to completely analyze its exact chemical composition. And they incredibly quickly discovered that the massive physical effect was absolutely not just present directly on the surface. The heavily porous soil had actually been completely and physically altered up to an incredible 14 physical inches deep, completely into the ground. And when the highly trained scientists strictly placed these exact soil samples entirely under incredibly heavy microscopic magnification and thoroughly subjected them to incredibly rigorous, highly advanced chemical testing, they immediately realized they were actively dealing with something that completely and entirely defied all known natural earth science. The completely normal dirt entirely inside the physical ring had been chemically and completely altered to actively become entirely and irreversibly hydrophobic. The completely natural organic materials and deeply rich minerals heavily present in the soil had been thoroughly subjected to a highly advanced, completely unknown physical process that completely and permanently stripped away their absolute physical ability to absorb absolutely any heavy water. And the highly frustrated scientific researchers aggressively tried absolutely everything to actively and completely reverse the physical effect. They aggressively baked the strange soil directly in high-temperature industrial ovens. They violently soaked it heavily in highly corrosive heavy chemical solvents, and they intensely subjected it to incredibly extreme, highly prolonged physical water pressure, exactly in the controlled lab. But absolutely, completely nothing physically worked. The strange, ashy soil remained completely stubbornly and highly water repellent. And even directly out on the isolated farm, as quiet months actively turned into incredibly long years, and heavy spring rains, and incredibly harsh. Freezing winter snows continuously and aggressively pounded the Delphos physical property. The strange ring simply completely refused to physically wash entirely away. It completely remained a perfectly, incredibly dry, heavily ashy circle right in the exact physical middle of an incredibly muddy field, completely and entirely baffling every single professional scientist who ever physically studied it. Because while incredibly thousands of regular everyday people actively report clearly seeing blurry, incredibly strange lights actively in the dark sky almost every single passing year, absolutely almost none of those highly documented sightings ever actively leave physically behind a massive, highly testable physical footprint. But directly on the freezing evening of November 2nd, 1971, absolutely. Something completely hovered entirely over the isolated Johnson farm, and it actively generated a highly chemical or deeply energetic physical reaction so incredibly and impossibly powerful that it fundamentally and permanently completely altered the exact basic physical properties of the Earth entirely, itself perfectly, leaving completely behind a highly glowing, aggressively hydrophobic physical scar that absolutely and completely refused to physically heal. And the highly extensive, incredibly detailed physical trace evidence completely collected by the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office and actively studied by the Center for UFO Studies perfectly makes the Delphos ring completely one of the absolute most physically documented and thoroughly scientifically tested, highly anomalous events completely in modern physical history. The exact strange soil samples have been completely carefully preserved and heavily continuously studied by strictly multiple highly advanced scientific institutions actively over the incredibly long last several quiet decades, and yet absolutely no highly terrestrial, completely natural explanation has ever been successfully found for exactly how the mundane dirt was completely and permanently physically transformed. And to this day, they do not have an explanation for it. And while a highly glowing ring of strange soil completely on a quiet, completely isolated Kansas farm, completely and aggressively defied the absolute laws of strictly natural earth physical science just a few incredibly quiet months, completely earlier, and absolutely top secret, highly trained government assassination squad would completely and brutally defy the exact direct orders of their own heavy military, completely in an incredibly brutal, heavily suppressed piece of incredibly dark modern history. On a heavily overcast afternoon in July of 1968, A 24-year-old man named Kim was walking through the crowded, incredibly loud alleys of a street market in Seoul, South Korea. And Kim was essentially just a low-level, completely unorganized, petty criminal who spent most of his days running small street scams and smuggling cheap cigarettes just to afford a bowl of hot noodles at the end of the night. So he was incredibly used to constantly looking over his shoulder for local beat cops and trying to stay completely invisible in the massive city crowds. But on this particular afternoon, as he stopped to buy a cheap steamed bun from a street vendor, he noticed two large men wearing very sharp, heavy, dark suits, standing perfectly still near the edge of the market. And these men were not looking at the vendor or the crowds. They were staring directly at Kim. So Kim immediately dropped his food, turned around, and started walking very quickly in the opposite direction. But before he could even reach the end of the narrow alleyway, two more men in heavy suits stepped out from behind a brick wall and completely blocked his physical path. Now, typically when you get boxed into an alleyway by men in heavy suits in Seoul, you are either going to get severely beaten for an unpaid gambling debt, or you are going straight to a dirty prison cell. So Kim tightly clenched his fists and fully prepared himself for a brutal physical fight. But the men didn't actually attack him or try to put heavy metal handcuffs on his wrists. Instead, they just quietly and firmly grabbed him by his thin shoulders, escorted him directly into the back seat of a waiting black sedan, and drove him to a very quiet, completely unmarked office building on the outskirts of the city. He was trapped. And when they finally brought him into a small, brightly lit room, they sat him down at a metal table and slid a piece of paper toward him. "We have a job for you," one of the men said. "What kind of job?" Kim asked, looking nervously at the closed door. "One that pays very well," the man replied. And the men in the suits went on to quietly explain that the South Korean government was aggressively recruiting a very small, highly specialized team for a classified military operation. They promised Kim that if he completely committed to this strict program, he would be paid a massive, life-changing salary. His petty criminal record would be permanently and entirely erased, and he would return home as a highly decorated, incredibly respected national hero. Now, Kim was basically homeless. He was constantly starving, and he literally had absolutely no other options or future prospects in the city. So this highly mysterious, lucrative offer seemed like an incredibly reasonable way to completely turn his desperate life around. So he picked up the pen, he signed his name, but the absolute second the ink dried on that contract, the sharp men in the suits completely stopped being polite. They immediately grabbed Kim by the back of his shirt, shoved him roughly out the back door, and threw him into the dark enclosed back of a heavy military transport truck. And when Kim finally adjusted his eyes to the pitch dark inside the truck, he realized he was physically packed in there with 30 other young, confused men who all looked exactly like him. They were all street toughs, petty thieves, and unemployed drifters who had basically been quietly scooped right off the local streets. And none of them had absolutely any idea where they were actually going. So the heavy truck drove continuously through the night until it finally reached the cold, dark coastline. And the men were violently herded onto a small, unmarked military boat that aggressively cut through the freezing waters of the Yellow Sea for several hours. And when the boat finally slammed into a rocky, totally desolate shoreline, the men were forcefully pushed out onto the freezing beach. They looked around and quickly realized they were on a completely uninhabited, heavily forested, incredibly isolated rock called Silmido Island. And waiting for them on the jagged beach was a massive squad of heavily armed, highly aggressive South Korean military guards. The guards immediately ordered the 31 men to completely strip off all of their civilian clothes and throw them into a massive pile in the dirt. And they threw them cheap, unbranded military fatigues and told them that their old identities were now completely and permanently dead. They were officially and secretly designated as Unit 684. And their sole, highly classified purpose in life was to be aggressively trained into a Black Ops suicide squad tasked with quietly infiltrating North Korea to violently assassinate the leader Kim Il-sung. And to prepare them for this highly impossible, incredibly lethal mission, the military guards immediately subjected the recruits to a level of physical and psychological torture that completely defied human limits. Now, training for a standard military operation usually involves strict discipline, heavy physical conditioning, and tactical combat drills. But on Selmido, the base commanders actively treated the 31 civilian recruits like absolute disposable animals. The men were forced to sprint for miles up the jagged, incredibly sharp mountain rocks, completely barefoot, completely tearing the skin off their soles. They were forced to swim for hours in the freezing, heavily churning ocean water until their muscles completely locked up and they nearly drowned. And if any recruit fell behind, complained, or physically collapsed from sheer exhaustion, the heavily armed guards would simply beat them mercilessly with heavy wooden clubs until they physically stood back up. And as part of their highly specialized brutal tactical conditioning, the military instructors eventually handed every single recruit a heavy olive green fragmentation hand grenade. The commanders specifically and aggressively told them that these exact grenades were the absolute most lethal, highest-grade explosives the government possessed. And they were strictly ordered to keep these heavy grenades strapped tightly to their chest, webbing every single second of every single day. So Kim and the other men literally slept, ate, and ran through the freezing mud, carrying these heavy, government-issued explosives constantly, knowing they were the ultimate destructive tool they would eventually use when they were completely surrounded deep inside enemy territory. But the incredibly brutal, completely unregulated training conditions on the isolated island were so extreme that over the course of the next 3 years, 7 of the original 31 men actually died. Some succumbed to extreme physical exposure in the freezing water. Others died from severe, untreated infections, and some were simply beaten to death by the guards for minor infractions. But the remaining 24 men, including Kim, physically survived. And they were completely and entirely transformed from skinny, unorganized, petty criminals into highly lethal, incredibly hardened, utterly fearless killing machines. They were in absolute peak physical condition, highly proficient in hand-to-hand combat, and completely ready to deploy across the dark border and sacrifice their lives for their country. But then, in the early months of 1971, the heavy atmosphere on the isolated island suddenly and dramatically shifted. The intense, highly aggressive daily combat training just inexplicably and completely stopped. The heavily armed military guards who had spent the last 3 years constantly screaming at them and beating them suddenly started completely ignoring the recruits. And the massive military supply boats that used to reliably bring them fresh food, new boots, and medical supplies completely stopped arriving at the jagged shoreline. So the 24 highly trained men were just left completely alone, in their freezing barracks, forced to eat heavily rotting, deeply insect-infested rations, just to physically survive the winter. And since the recruits had absolutely no physical access to outside radios or newspapers, they had absolutely no idea that the global political landscape had completely and massively changed. Diplomatic relations between North and South Korea had suddenly and unexpectedly begun to officially thaw, and the two respective governments were actually engaging in quiet, highly publicized peace talks. And so the top-secret, highly illegal assassination mission that Unit 684 had been brutally trained for was quietly and completely canceled by the top military brass in Seoul. But the government could not simply release these 24 lethal men back onto the public streets, because their very physical existence was massive, undeniable proof of a highly illegal, off-the-books assassination plot that could completely destroy the fragile peace talks. So the military basically just completely abandoned them on the freezing island, quietly hoping they would slowly starve to death or simply kill each other in the extreme isolation. But as the freezing weeks slowly turn into sweltering summer months, Kim starts to aggressively notice the way the heavily armed guards are nervously looking at them across the barbed wire fence. The guards are physically trembling, constantly keeping their heavy rifles raised and whispering quietly amongst themselves whenever the recruits walk past. And Kim, who has survived his entire youth by successfully reading the dangerous body language of corrupt street cops, immediately understands exactly what those nervous, panicked looks actually mean. "They are going to kill us," Kim whispers in the dark barracks. "We have to leave another man," says quietly. And Kim is absolutely right. The 24 surviving men quickly and collectively realize that the government they have bled and suffered for is actively preparing to quietly execute all of them in the dirt, just to permanently cover up the entire illegal operation. And because they are highly trained, incredibly lethal Black Ops soldiers, they are absolutely not going to just sit quietly in the dark and wait to be formally executed. So they spend several tense, completely silent days, meticulously analyzing the guards' patrol routes, mapping out the armory locations, and quietly sharpening heavy pieces of scrap metal into crude, lethal knives. And then, very early on, the dark, incredibly foggy morning of August 23rd, 1971, the 24 men violently and aggressively mutiny. They creep silently out of their wooden barracks, completely blending into the thick morning fog, and they move like absolute ghosts toward the primary guard posts. They ambush the heavily armed military guards with absolute brutal precision, using their crude knives and bare hands to silently snap their necks and slit their throats before the guards can even reach for their heavy radios. And once they successfully secure the guards' heavy rifles and ammunition, the recruits aggressively storm the main administrative building and brutally slaughter almost every single military commander on the entire island, and leaving the isolated island completely littered with the bloody bodies of their former tormentors, the 24 heavily armed men aggressively sprint down to the jagged beach and violently hijack a small civilian smuggling boat that had unfortunately anchored nearby. They force the panicked captain to immediately navigate the boat directly across the choppy ocean toward the mainland city of Incheon. And as soon as the heavy wooden boat slams into the mainland docks, the heavily armed men pour out onto the busy civilian streets, causing absolute unadulterated panic among the local morning commuters. So the men aggressively charge down the main coastal road. They violently smash the thick glass windows with the heavy butts of their rifles, physically drag the panicked passengers to the back of the bus, and aim their stolen weapons directly at the shaking driver's head. "Drive straight to the capital," Kim tells the panicked bus driver. And the driver immediately slams his heavy foot onto the gas pedal, aggressively steering the massive bus directly toward the bustling center of Seoul. The men have absolutely no formal escape plan and no highly organized endgame. They just want to aggressively drive the hijacked bus directly up to the presidential Blue House and violently demand answers from the top government officials who had brutally tortured and completely abandoned them. But the South Korean military has already received frantic radio reports about the bloody massacre on the island and the hijacked bus currently speeding toward the heavily populated capital. So the military immediately declares a massive citywide state of emergency. They completely lock down the entire surrounding region aggressively, deploying thousands of heavily armed combat troops, heavy armored personnel carriers, and massive military barricades directly across the main highway leading into Seoul. And as the hijacked public bus aggressively barrels down the paved road and rapidly approaches the massive military blockade, the army troops immediately and aggressively open heavy, continuous fire. Hundreds of heavy, high-caliber military bullets violently rip directly through the thin metal siding of the moving bus, completely shattering the large glass windows and instantly killing several of the panicked civilian hostages and multiple recruits. The heavy bus violently swerves across the paved road, heavily crashing into the thick roadside trees and grinding to a violent, complete halt in a massive cloud of dark smoke and dirt. And the surviving recruits aggressively return heavy fire from the shattered windows, desperately fighting a massive, completely unwinnable war against their own country's military on a busy public highway. But after several intense, incredibly bloody minutes of continuous gunfire, the heavy military response completely overwhelms the trapped men. They are totally out of stolen ammunition, heavily bleeding from multiple severe gunshot wounds, and completely surrounded by hundreds of advancing, heavily armed soldiers. And they all deeply know that if they are captured alive, they will be brutally tortured and quietly erased in a dark, underground military prison. So Kim and the surviving members of his squad slowly lower their empty rifles and quietly look down at their heavy chest webbing. They reach down with their bloody hands and unclip the heavy olive green government-issued hand grenades they had been forced to carry every single day on the island. They pull the heavy metal pins, and the massive, deafening explosions completely and violently ripped the hijacked bus entirely apart in a massive fireball of twisted metal and shattered glass, instantly killing every single surviving recruit inside. And following the incredibly violent, highly public massacre on the highway, the South Korean government aggressively and immediately initiated a massive total cover-up. They quickly labeled the men as armed communist agents. From the North, heavily suppressed all local media reporting and completely erased all official military records of Unit 684's very physical existence. And the brutal mutiny that occurred on August 23, 1971, remained a deeply hidden, highly classified national secret for over 30 long years, until a formal Truth Commission finally and officially declassified the classified military report in 2006. And while a top-secret government assassination squad violently fighting their way to the capital was completely suppressed by the military just a few months later, and thousands of miles away, a perfect, sophisticated crime would be completely undone by a pile of unwashed dishes. On a quiet Friday evening in March of 1972, a bank manager named Thomas stood in the center of the main lobby of the United California Bank in Laguna Niguel, California, and he was just watching his staff slowly close down the teller windows for the weekend. Now, Laguna Niguel was an incredibly wealthy, highly affluent community located right along the southern coast. And because the residents of this town were mostly highly successful executives, business owners, and local politicians, the United California Bank was absolutely filled to the brim with vast amounts of physical wealth. And Thomas took his job as the primary custodian of that wealth incredibly seriously. He was a very meticulous, highly structured man who wore perfectly pressed suits and never left the building until he had personally verified every single security protocol. So as the last few employees finally grabbed their coats and walked out the heavy glass front doors, Thomas made his way directly to the back of the building to physically secure the main vault. And this vault was essentially a massive, state-of-the-art concrete fortress built directly into the foundation of the bank. It had incredibly thick, reinforced concrete walls, and it was completely protected by a highly complex, highly sensitive grid of seismic alarm sensors designed to immediately detect even the slightest physical vibration. And the massive steel vault door was so incredibly heavy that it actually took Thomas a significant amount of physical effort just to manually swing it completely shut. He aggressively spun the heavy brass dials, completely locking the massive vault door in place. And then he walked over to the main security panel on the wall, entered his private passcodes, and actively engaged the building's primary alarm system. He listened for the sharp electronic beep, confirming the system was fully armed. And then he walked out the front door, locked it tightly behind him, and drove home to spend a completely normal, quiet weekend with his family. But on Monday morning, when Thomas pulled his car back into the employee parking lot and walked up to the front doors of the bank, he immediately noticed something was physically wrong. The heavy glass doors were completely locked and totally untouched, just exactly as he had left them on Friday. But as he unlocked the door and stepped inside the main lobby, the physical air inside the bank was incredibly thick and heavily clouded. He could distinctly smell the sharp, deeply bitter scent of burnt explosives and heavy concrete dust. And the entire lobby was completely covered in a fine, powdery gray film. So Thomas immediately dropped his briefcase on the floor and ran aggressively down the main hallway, directly toward the back of the building. And when he reached the secure back room, he stopped completely dead in his tracks. The massive steel vault door was still perfectly closed and entirely locked. But when Thomas physically looked up, he saw a massive, jagged hole blown completely through the thick, reinforced concrete roof directly above the vault. The bright California morning sunlight was actively pouring straight down through the massive hole, completely illuminating the absolutely destroyed interior of the vault. The heavy metal safety deposit boxes that lined the interior walls had been violently ripped completely open. The heavy steel cash drawers were completely gutted and thrown aggressively onto the floor. And an estimated $30 million in untraceable cash-heavy gold bonds and extremely expensive family jewelry was just completely and entirely gone. And within just a few short hours, the United California Bank was completely surrounded by dozens of heavily armed federal agents. The FBI had immediately taken total jurisdiction over the crime scene because $30 million made this the absolute largest, most expensive bank heist in American history at the time. And the lead investigator, a highly experienced, deeply pragmatic agent named Miller, immediately established a mobile command center right in the bank's parking lot. Miller walked directly into the gutted vault, physically crunching over the heavy concrete debris, and he meticulously analyzed the exact point of entry. And he immediately realized they were dealing with an incredibly sophisticated, highly professional crew. Because the thieves had not just blown a random hole in the roof, they had manually carried incredibly heavy industrial-grade core drills all the way up to the roof of the bank. And they had perfectly and meticulously drilled a precise circular pattern directly through 3 solid feet of steel-reinforced concrete. And then they had used highly specific, expertly measured charges of dynamite to gently pop the concrete plug completely out without physically collapsing the surrounding roof structure. But the most baffling physical evidence was the alarm system. "Did anyone touch this security panel?" Miller asked. "No, it hasn't been touched since Friday," Thomas replied. "The seismic sensors were completely bypassed," Miller said, staring at the exposed wiring. And Miller was absolutely right. The thieves had somehow manually accessed the highly secure exterior alarm wires and actively installed a custom electronic bridge that perfectly tricked the system into thinking the vault was completely secure even while they were back, aggressively detonating dynamite directly above it. So, Miller aggressively deployed his absolute best forensic technicians into the vault. They spent several long, tedious days meticulously dusting every single torn safety deposit box for fingerprints. They used heavy industrial vacuums to actively sweep the concrete floor for any dropped hairs, loose fabric fibers, or discarded tools. But after an entire week of continuous, highly aggressive searching, the forensic team came back completely empty-handed. The thieves had apparently worn heavy protective suits, thick gloves, and had meticulously collected every single piece of physical trash before climbing back out of the roof. They left absolutely zero physical evidence behind. Now, normally when a highly complex security system is bypassed so perfectly, the FBI naturally assumes they are dealing with an inside job, because actively tricking a seismic alarm grid requires highly classified, deeply technical knowledge of the specific bank's wiring schematics. And so, Miller aggressively turned his entire investigation directly onto the bank's employees. He brought Thomas into a small, windowless interrogation room and heavily questioned him for hours about his personal finances, his private debts, and his exact whereabouts over the weekend. He aggressively pulled Thomas's bank records and actively audited his personal accounts. But Thomas's life was completely mundane, and his alibi was absolutely rock solid. He had spent the entire weekend hosting a large, heavily attended family barbecue in his backyard, completely surrounded by dozens of reliable witnesses. So Miller aggressively pivoted and targeted the chief security technician for the private alarm company. He sent federal agents to raid the technician's home and aggressively seize all of his private tools and technical manuals. But that also turned out to be a massive, frustrating dead end. The technician had been physically out of the state on a highly documented hunting trip the entire weekend, and his bank accounts showed absolutely no sudden influx of massive wealth. And so the FBI aggressively expanded their suspect pool to the local organized crime syndicates currently operating out of Los Angeles. Miller heavily organized a series of highly aggressive, completely unannounced raids on several known mob hangouts and illegal gambling dens. Federal agents kicked down doors, physically pinned known mob enforcers to the ground, and actively tore their businesses apart looking for the stolen $30 million. But the local mob bosses were genuinely and completely surprised by the FBI's heavy presence. And Miller quickly realized that the sheer clinical precision of the rooftop entry and the highly technical alarm bypass absolutely did not match the typical, highly aggressive brute force tactics heavily favored by the local crime families. And as quiet weeks slowly turned into incredibly frustrating months, the massive investigation began to aggressively stall. The national press was relentlessly mocking the FBI, heavily publishing front-page stories about how the perfect criminals had simply walked away with $30 million and completely vanished into thin air. And Miller and his team began to operate under a very heavy, highly frustrating false assumption. They firmly believed that because the thieves had executed the physical break-in with such absolute flawless perfection, and had left the heavily destroyed vault completely devoid of any physical evidence, these criminals were essentially ghosts. The FBI completely assumed that a crew this highly meticulous and this heavily disciplined would absolutely never leave a single physical trace of their existence anywhere in the entire state of California. But Miller completely refused to just close the file and give up. He heavily ordered his exhausted agents to manually canvass the entire surrounding region, aggressively looking for any place a large, highly equipped crew could have quietly stayed during the weekend of the heist. They spent weeks systematically walking door to door, heavily interviewing local motel owners, short-term landlords, and property managers. A local landlord who managed properties in a very quiet, highly affluent neighborhood just a few miles from the bank reported that a group of out-of-town men had rented a luxury townhouse right before the weekend of the heist. The landlord explicitly noted that the men had paid for the rental entirely in crisp, unmarked cash, claimed to be traveling businessmen, and then had completely abruptly vanished on Sunday night without returning the keys. So Miller aggressively secured a federal search warrant, heavily mobilized his forensic team, and quickly drove directly to the luxury townhouse. The federal agents manually breached the heavy front door and aggressively spread out to completely search the entire property. But as Miller slowly walked through the quiet, empty rooms, his heavy frustration instantly returned. Because the townhouse was absolutely, completely spotless. The men had meticulously and aggressively scrubbed the entire physical property before they abandoned it. The heavy living room carpets had been completely and thoroughly vacuumed. The bathroom sinks and showers had been heavily bleached and wiped entirely down, and the kitchen counters were completely bare and physically gleaming. The criminals had been just as highly meticulous and aggressively disciplined in cleaning their temporary safe house as they had been inside the bank vault. It physically looked like an absolute dead end. And so Miller just heavily sighed, completely defeated, and he leaned his tired body directly against the clean kitchen counter. He rubbed his exhausted eyes, actively thinking about how he was going to have to report this massive failure to his superiors. And as he stood there in the quiet kitchen, he casually reached his hand out and physically grabbed the metal handle of the sleek, under-counter dishwasher. He pulled the heavy door down just to quickly check inside. And sitting perfectly neatly on the sliding wire racks were dozens of dirty ceramic plates, heavy coffee mugs, and clear water glasses. The master thieves had meticulously planned and flawlessly executed the absolute largest $30 million heist in American history. They had perfectly bypassed the alarms, expertly detonated the dynamite, and heavily scrubbed the entire townhouse. But in their frantic, highly adrenaline-fueled rush to completely abandon the property and catch their commercial flight back to Ohio, they had carefully loaded all of their unwashed, heavily handled dishes directly into the machine, but they had simply forgotten to push the start button. So Miller immediately called his forensic team directly into the kitchen. The highly trained technicians meticulously pulled the dirty, unwashed plates and clear glasses out of the machine one by one. They aggressively applied heavy, dark dusting powder to the smooth glass surfaces, and they easily lifted dozens of perfectly preserved Absolutely crystal clear fingerprints directly from the unwashed dishware. And when the FBI aggressively ran those highly pristine fingerprints through their national database, they instantly got a massive, undeniable match. The prints belonged directly to Emil Dincio and his highly professional, deeply secretive crew of master thieves based entirely out of Ohio. The FBI immediately mobilized a massive tactical strike team, flew directly to Ohio, and aggressively raided the crew's properties, catching the masterminds completely by surprise and actively recovering a massive portion of the stolen $30 million. And Emil Dincio and his entire crew were formally arrested and heavily charged in 1972, completely taking down the most successful bank robbers in the country over a completely mundane household chore. And while a crew of master thieves saw their flawless heist completely destroyed by a simple kitchen appliance, just a year earlier, a massive crowd of everyday people would find themselves trapped in a deadly, unstoppable avalanche on a concrete stairway. On a bitterly cold, heavily overcast afternoon in early January of 1971, a 22-year-old man named Ian stood in his small, drafty kitchen in Glasgow, Scotland, quickly wrapping a heavy wool scarf tightly around his neck. And Ian was a young, highly pragmatic guy who spent his entire week doing incredibly demanding, back-breaking physical labor down at the local shipyards along the River Clyde. So he spent most of his days covered in heavy grease, breathing in thick metal dust and operating massive industrial welding equipment. And because his weekday life was so physically exhausting and totally monotonous, his entire weekend completely revolved around one specific, highly intense passion. Ian was an absolutely massive, die-hard supporter of the Rangers Football Club. And in Glasgow, supporting a local football team was not just a casual weekend hobby. It was essentially a deeply ingrained, highly serious way of life that dictated entirely who you associated with, what pubs you drank in, and exactly how you spent your hard-earned money. Now, today was not just any standard regular league match. Today was January 2nd, which meant it was the traditional New Year's Bank holiday weekend. And more importantly, the Rangers were actively playing against their absolute biggest, most bitter crosstown rivals, Celtic. And this specific rivalry, known globally as the Old Firm, was widely considered one of the absolute most intense, heavily contested, and deeply divided sporting events in the entire world. So, the entire city of Glasgow essentially completely shut down on the day of an Old Firm match. And Ian walked out of his small apartment, met up with his closest childhood friend on the street corner, and together they joined a massive, heavily bundled sea of fans aggressively marching directly toward Ibrox Stadium. And as they walked through the freezing damp streets, the physical weather in Glasgow began to heavily and rapidly deteriorate. A very thick, heavily freezing winter fog began to aggressively roll in directly off the river, completely covering the tall brick buildings and heavily reducing physical visibility down to just a few dozen feet. But the massive crowd of fans didn't care about the freezing fog at all. They just aggressively pushed their way forward, laughing loudly, singing team songs, and deeply breathing in the heavy, familiar smells of hot meat pies and stale spilled beer that completely surrounded the stadium grounds. And when Ian and his friend finally handed over their paper tickets and physically walked through the heavy iron turnstiles into Ibrox Stadium, they immediately headed directly toward their usual spot, located at the Copland Road end of the Meadows, massive concrete structure. Now, stadiums in the United Kingdom, back in 1971, were structurally completely different from the modern, highly regulated, all-seater arenas that exist today. Back then, the vast majority of the stadium simply consisted of massive, steeply angled concrete terraces. There were absolutely no individual plastic seats. There were no designated physical aisles. It was literally just a giant sloping concrete mountain where tens of thousands of grown men just physically stood shoulder to shoulder for 2 solid hours. And the absolute only things keeping the massive crowds from violently tumbling forward down the steep concrete steps were these thick, heavy steel crush barriers that were heavily bolted directly deep into the concrete at various intervals. So Ian and his friend aggressively squeezed their way directly into the massive, tightly packed crowd on the terrace. And by the time the referee officially blew his whistle to start the match, there were over 80,000 people physically crammed tightly into Ibrox Stadium. And standing on a completely packed terrace was an incredibly unique, highly physical experience. You were packed in so incredibly tightly that you essentially lost all individual physical control over your own body. If the massive crowd suddenly surged forward to look at a play on the field, you were physically carried forward with them. And if the crowd swayed heavily to the left, your feet physically left the concrete, and you were aggressively pushed to the left. You essentially just had to completely surrender your balance to the physical movement of the people pressing tightly against your chest and your back. And as the match slowly progressed into the second half, the freezing heavy fog completely descended entirely over the open stadium. It became so incredibly thick and heavily opaque that from where Ian was standing high up on the terraces, he literally could not even see the players running around on the opposite side of the green pitch. He could only actively track the progression of the game by intensely listening to the heavy roars and sudden groans of the unseen crowd located on the other side of the stadium. And the match was incredibly tense, highly defensive, and entirely scoreless for almost the entire 90 minutes. "Are you seeing anything out there?" Ian asked, trying to peer through the thick fog. "Not a single thing," his friend replied, stamping his freezing feet on the concrete. "Just listen for the whistle." "Let's just beat the crowd," Ian said, looking toward the exits. So right exactly as the stadium clock aggressively ticked toward the 89th minute, the absolute worst possible thing happened for Ian and the thousands of Rangers fans standing tightly around him. Through the thick, heavy fog, they suddenly heard a massive, deafening, explosive roar aggressively erupt directly from the Celtic side of the stadium. Celtic had just scored a late, highly dramatic goal to take a 1-0 lead right at the absolute dying moments of the match. And an incredibly heavy, completely dead silence instantly fell entirely over Ian's side of the stadium. Because with only about 60 seconds left on the clock, the game was essentially over. And so Ian and his friend just heavily sighed, totally defeated, and they simultaneously decided to just leave the stadium right now, just a minute or two early, strictly so they could avoid being caught in the massive, highly congested foot traffic that was about to completely flood the dark Glasgow streets. So they slowly turned around and they began to aggressively push their way directly back up through the tightly packed standing crowd, physically making their way toward the primary exit point located at the absolute top of the concrete terrace. And this specific exit route was locally known by everyone as Stairway 13. Now, Stairway 13 was a massive, incredibly steep, completely open-air concrete passageway that funneled thousands of exiting fans directly down from the high terraces straight to the street level below. It was a notoriously steep, highly uncomfortable descent, and it was heavily partitioned by tall, thick steel guardrails designed to physically divide the exiting crowd into smaller, more manageable vertical lanes. And as Ian and his friend finally reached the absolute top of the massive concrete stairway and slowly began to make their way down the steep steps, Ian casually looked down through the heavy freezing fog, and he clearly noticed a young father walking a few dozen yards ahead of them near the bottom of the long stairs. And to physically protect his young son from the heavy, aggressively pushing crowd, the father had hoisted the small, maybe 8-year-old boy completely up onto his shoulders. The boy was wearing a thick blue scarf, and he was laughing loudly, completely safely elevated high above the tightly packed sea of heavy wool coats, making their way down the concrete steps. But as Ian and his friend were roughly halfway down the steep concrete structure, completely surrounded by thousands of heavily bundled, deeply disappointed fans quietly shuffling toward the street, they suddenly heard something completely impossible. Coming directly from the invisible stadium behind them, a massive, incredibly deafening, completely unhinged roar suddenly violently erupted into the freezing fog. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of the Rangers fans actively celebrating. In the absolute final dying seconds of stoppage time, a Rangers player named Colin Stein had somehow managed to score a miraculous equalizer. The game was suddenly tied at 1-1. And as the massive deafening cheer physically rolled directly out of the stadium and aggressively echoed down the steep walls of Stairway 13, the physical dynamic of the exiting crowd instantly and violently shifted. The heavy shuffling mass of people suddenly became highly energized and deeply chaotic. And as Ian steps heavily down onto the next concrete step, he violently feels a sudden, massive surge of heavy physical pressure actively hit him directly in the middle of his back. The massive crowd around him is no longer just walking. It is physically shifting and aggressively compressing as a single, massive, unyielding organism. And to understand exactly what happens next, you have to deeply understand the highly specific, incredibly unforgiving physics of a massive crowd crush. When a crowd density reaches about 2 or 3 people per square meter, you can physically move freely. At 4 or 5 people, you are physically bumping shoulders, and it is highly uncomfortable, but you are completely safe. But when a crowd density aggressively reaches 7 or 8 people per square meter, the crowd officially ceases to be a group of individuals. It entirely becomes a fluid mass, completely governed strictly by fluid dynamics. Physical shockwaves can visibly travel directly through the human bodies exactly like heavy ripples through a pool of water. And if you are physically caught in the absolute middle of that fluid mass, you lose all total control of your movement. You are completely physically at the absolute mercy of the thousands of pounds of collective pressure aggressively pushing against you from all sides. Ian instantly feels his arms become aggressively and forcefully pinned directly against his ribcage. He tries to quickly lift his hands up to physically protect his chest, but the tightly packed bodies heavily pressing against him are completely solid and totally unyielding. The physical pressure aggressively pushing down from the massive crowd at the absolute top of the steep stairway continues to rapidly build. The people up at the top of the terrace are completely and entirely blind to what is happening down below them in the thick, freezing fog. They have absolutely no idea that the physical flow of the crowd has suddenly completely stalled. They are just aggressively and happily pushing forward, eager to get out into the street and talk about the amazing last-minute goal. But down near the absolute bottom of Stairway 13, completely invisible to the thousands of people aggressively pushing from the top, a fatal, highly physical blockage has quietly occurred. That young father who is carrying his small son on his heavy shoulders has suddenly stumbled on one of the steep, slick concrete steps. He completely loses his footing and he pitches heavily forward, falling directly onto the hard concrete. And because the crowd is moving so incredibly densely and so fast, the people directly immediately behind the father have absolutely no physical space to stop or step around him. So they violently trip directly over his fallen body, immediately collapsing right on top of him, and the people directly behind them violently trip right over them. And within just a matter of incredibly rapid, chaotic seconds, a massive, totally immovable barrier of tangled human bodies begins to aggressively build right near the bottom of the steep concrete stairway. But the 80,000 people still completely inside the stadium are still aggressively forcing their way directly toward the top of the stairs, completely and entirely unaware of the massive pileup below. So the sheer unyielding physical mass of the exiting crowd continues to aggressively push heavily downward. And this creates a massive, totally unstoppable physical avalanche. Ian suddenly feels his heavy work boots physically lift completely off the solid concrete steps. The pressure surrounding his torso is so incredibly massive that he is physically suspended entirely in midair, tightly wedged directly between the heavy chests and backs of the strangers immediately surrounding him. The air completely leaves his lungs in a sudden, violent rush, and he quickly realizes he absolutely cannot physically expand his chest to take another breath. And this is exactly how people actually die in a massive crowd crush. It is incredibly rarely from actually being trampled underfoot. It is almost strictly from compressive asphyxia. The sheer physical pressure of the bodies tightly pressing against your torso is so incredibly immense that your diaphragm simply lacks the physical strength to expand your lungs against the heavy weight. You are essentially totally suffocated while standing completely upright in an open-air environment, and the pressure continuing to heavily push down the steep concrete steps of Stairway 13 becomes so incredibly extreme that the physical infrastructure of the stadium itself begins to violently fail. The massive, thick steel guardrails that are heavily bolted deep into the concrete to physically divide the crowd begin to loudly groan under the sheer weight of thousands of compressing bodies. And then, with a massive, deafening metallic snap, the heavy steel barriers physically buckle and completely break, entirely apart. The solid steel simply violently tears exactly like thin aluminum foil under the massive physical pressure of the fluid crowd. And when the steel barriers violently give way, the tight crowd entirely loses all remaining physical support. Hundreds of tightly packed people violently collapse heavily to the side and completely fall down the steep steps directly on top of the massive pile of bodies, already completely blocking the bottom of the exit. Ian violently falls forward into the massive tangled pile, completely landing heavily on his side. He is instantly buried under the incredibly heavy physical weight of 3 or 4 adult men who immediately crash down directly on top of him. The entire steep stairway is completely filled with an incredibly massive tangled mountain of arms, legs, and heavy wool coats that stretches over 6 feet high in the thick, freezing fog. And as Ian lies trapped beneath the incredibly crushing weight, desperately fighting for tiny, shallow gasps of freezing air, he realizes that the massive crowd has suddenly gone completely and entirely silent. There is no loud screaming. There is no aggressive yelling for help. Because the hundreds of people tightly trapped deep inside the massive pile physically do not have enough oxygen in their compressed lungs to make a single sound, they are just lying there in the thick, freezing fog, completely silently suffocating under the unyielding weight of their fellow fans. By the time the stadium police and the local emergency medical responders finally physically realize what has happened and violently sprint directly to the bottom of Stairway 13, they are completely confronted with an absolutely devastating physical reality. The massive mountain of tangled bodies is so incredibly densely packed and tightly compressed that the heavy police officers literally cannot physically pull the people free. They aggressively grab the arms and heavy coats of the people on the top of the pile, but they have to physically use massive extreme force to actively pry the bodies apart, treating them essentially exactly like heavy interlocked logs of wood. Ian eventually feels the incredibly heavy, crushing weight violently lifted off of his bruised chest, as 2 large police officers aggressively drag him roughly out of the massive pile and heavily lay him directly down on the cold, damp grass of the nearby stadium pitch. He lies there violently, gasping for heavy burning breaths of freezing air, completely surrounded by dozens of local doctors and panicked nurses who are aggressively performing chest compressions on completely motionless fans all around him. And despite the frantic, highly aggressive medical response directly on the cold grass, the sheer physical reality of compressive asphyxia is incredibly unforgiving. By the time the massive concrete stairway is finally completely cleared of the tangled bodies, the absolute scale of the tragedy becomes undeniable. Now, in the immediate, highly chaotic aftermath of the disaster, the local newspapers and the general public heavily assumed a very specific, widely accepted theory. They completely believed that the fans who had left the stadium early had suddenly heard that late miraculous Rangers goal, and they had violently turned around and aggressively tried to sprint directly back up Stairway 13. And the public heavily assumed that this massive group of people actively running up the stairs violently collided with the massive group of people aggressively coming down the stairs, actively creating the deadly crush. But when the UK government officially launched a massive, highly detailed fatal accident inquiry to completely investigate the disaster, they meticulously reviewed the physical evidence and heavily interviewed hundreds of surviving witnesses, like Ian. And the inquiry completely and definitively proved that the widely accepted public theory was entirely and utterly false. Nobody had violently turned around to run back up the steep stairs. The crowd was completely and entirely moving in the exact same downward direction the entire time. And the official inquiry completely confirmed that the massive, terrifying physical avalanche of human bodies was strictly triggered by one incredibly minor, totally random event. Just exactly like that father, heavily carrying his young son on his shoulders. Someone near the absolute bottom of the steep, heavily congested stairs had simply tripped on the concrete. And because the massive 80,000-person crowd at the top completely continued to aggressively push forward into the dark, freezing fog, completely unaware of the minor stumble below, the physical pressure instantly created a massive, deadly, unstoppable choke point that literally physically bent thick steel. 66 people lost their lives on the cold concrete of Stairway 13 on January 2nd, 1971, making it the absolute worst football-related disaster in British history at the time. And the incredibly devastating mechanical findings of the official inquiry heavily forced governments all over the world to completely and entirely overhaul their global stadium safety designs, strictly banning steep, uninterrupted concrete standing terraces to actively prevent a minor trip from ever turning into a massive physical meat grinder again. And to this day, they do not have an explanation for how stadium architects failed to anticipate the unyielding physics of a moving crowd. And while a routine exit down a stadium stairway turned into a deadly, unstoppable avalanche of human bodies due to a minor trip at the bottom just a few months later, and across the North Sea, an entirely untrained police department would turn a standard routine bank robbery into a highly televised, bloody street war. On the morning of August 4th, 1971, a 24-year-old bank teller named Ingrid walked through the heavy glass doors of her branch on Prinzregentenstrasse in Munich, Germany. And as she stepped behind the polished wooden counter, she immediately began her strict daily routine. Ingrid was an incredibly meticulous, highly organized woman who prided herself on absolute precision. She spent the first hour of her shift carefully organizing the thick stacks of newly printed Deutschmarks in her cash drawer, verifying the heavy metal safety deposit logs, and greeting the early morning customers who walked in off the busy city street. Prinzregentenstrasse was a very wealthy, highly trafficked avenue lined with beautiful old trees and expensive shops. So the bank was usually filled with quiet, well-dressed business owners and local residents making their routine daily deposits. And for the first few hours of the morning, everything inside the bank was completely normal, highly efficient, and incredibly peaceful. But right around mid-morning, the heavy glass front doors of the bank swung open, and two men quickly walked inside. Their names were Hans-Jörg Amaeus and Dmitry Todorov. And right away, Ingrid noticed that these two men looked completely out of place. Despite the fact that it was a very warm, bright August day, both men were wearing heavy, thick jackets that were zipped up awkwardly high. They didn't walk toward the little tables to fill out deposit slips, and they didn't wait patiently in the roped-off line. Instead, they walked aggressively straight up to Ingrid's counter. And before she could even ask how she could help them, Amaeus reached his hand deep into his heavy jacket and pulled out a dark, loaded handgun. He pointed the heavy metal barrel directly across the polished wood counter, aiming it squarely at Ingrid's chest. "Put the money in the bag," Amaeus said. "Do not press any buttons," Todorov added. And Ingrid physically froze, her heart violently pounding against her ribs as she stared down the dark barrel of the weapon. She immediately reached her shaking hands into her cash drawer and began frantically grabbing the thick stacks of paper currency, rapidly throwing them into the heavy canvas bag Todorov had thrown onto the counter. She kept her head down, completely avoiding eye contact with the two armed men, desperately trying to comply with their exact demands. But as she leaned heavily forward to grab the last stack of bills from the back of her drawer, her knee intentionally and forcefully bumped against a small hidden button located directly underneath her desk. It was the bank's silent alarm. And because it was completely silent, the two robbers had absolutely no idea that a direct emergency signal was currently flashing rapidly at the central Munich police headquarters. So, Amaeus and Todorov grabbed the heavy canvas bag filled with cash, firmly tucked their weapons back into their jackets, and turned to quickly walk out the front doors. They thought they had just pulled off a completely flawless, incredibly fast robbery. But as they reached out to push the heavy glass doors open, they suddenly heard a sound that made their stomachs drop. Coming from far down the avenue, rapidly growing louder and louder by the second, was the distinct, highly piercing wail of multiple police sirens. The two men stopped completely dead in their tracks and looked through the large front windows. And they saw several marked Munich police cruisers aggressively swerving around the local traffic, screeching to a heavy halt directly in front of the bank. Uniformed officers began rapidly jumping out of their vehicles and physically blocking the main street. Amaeus and Todorov instantly realized they were completely trapped. The front exit was heavily blocked by police vehicles, and the bank branch did not have an accessible rear exit that led to the street. So the two men aggressively pulled their handguns back out, violently spun around, and began loudly shouting at the terrified employees and customers. They forcefully ordered every single person in the lobby to drop immediately down onto the hard marble floor. And as Ingrid and the other hostages curled up into tight balls on the ground, covering their heads with their shaking hands, the robbers quickly moved to the heavy glass front doors and locked them completely shut. From that exact moment, a standard routine bank robbery officially escalated into a massive, highly volatile hostage situation. Now, typically, when a modern law enforcement agency responds to a confirmed hostage situation, they immediately deploy a highly specialized tactical team. They bring in heavily armored vehicles, heavily armed SWAT officers, and highly trained hostage negotiators, whose entire job is to psychologically de-escalate the armed suspects. But the Munich Police Department in 1971 was fundamentally and structurally completely different. They were essentially just a post-war administrative force. They spent their days directing heavy city traffic, investigating petty neighborhood thefts, and managing large public crowds during festivals. They had absolutely no dedicated tactical units, zero specialized communication equipment, and absolutely no professional training for a hostage crisis. The officers currently standing nervously behind their cars outside the bank were just standard beat cops wearing regular cloth uniforms and carrying standard-issue low-capacity sidearms. And as the long, grueling hours began to slowly tick by the physical conditions inside, the locked bank rapidly deteriorated. The air conditioning had been completely shut off, and the bright August sun was aggressively beating down through the large glass windows, turning the enclosed bank lobby into an absolute oven. The hostages were heavily sweating, physically trembling from exhaustion, and quietly crying on the marble floor. Amaeus and Todorov were aggressively pacing back and forth across the lobby, wildly waving their loaded handguns and constantly peering out the windows at the growing police presence. Outside on the street, the situation was becoming incredibly chaotic. Massive crowds of local civilians had gathered heavily behind the police lines to watch the standoff. And heavily equipped local television crews had set up massive broadcasting cameras directly on the sidewalks, actively beaming the live tense standoff into millions of living rooms across West Germany. So the local police chief, realizing he had to do something, ordered one of his senior detectives to grab a heavy plastic megaphone and try to physically negotiate with the armed men. The detective slowly walked up to the edge of the police barricade, raised the megaphone, and asked the robbers exactly what they wanted. Amaeus slightly cracked open one of the heavy glass doors, keeping his body completely hidden behind the thick frame, and yelled out into the street. "We want a car out front in 10 minutes, Amaeus said. "We are bringing the car up now," the detective replied. "If we see a trick, we will shoot them," Todorov said. And so the Munich police scrambled to quickly find a suitable civilian vehicle. They aggressively commandeered a standard passenger car and slowly parked it directly at the curb, just a few dozen feet from the bank's front doors. But the police commanders secretly decided that they were absolutely not going to let these two armed men drive away with innocent hostages in the back seat. They hastily formed a completely improvised tactical plan. They grabbed a few regular patrol officers who were known to be decent shots at the local firing range, handed them standard basic rifles, and aggressively ordered them to physically climb up onto the roofs of the surrounding buildings. These men were not highly trained snipers. They did not have high-powered optical scopes. They did not have heavy stabilizing bipods. And most importantly, they did not have any two-way radios to actively communicate with each other. They were just regular cops lying nervously on hot rooftops, completely disconnected from the ground commanders. Inside the sweltering bank, Amais and Todorov saw the getaway car finally pull up to the curb. They aggressively grabbed two of the hostages from the floor, firmly yanking them tightly against their chests. One of the robbers heavily wrapped his thick arm around a young woman's neck, physically pressing the cold metal barrel of his handgun directly hard against her temple. They intended to use these two innocent people as human shields to physically cross the open sidewalk and get into the waiting vehicle. And as the heavy locks on the bank doors clicked open, the entire crowded avenue went completely and utterly silent. The live television cameras aggressively zoomed in on the glass doors. The two robbers slowly stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, heavily dragging the terrified hostages with them. They walked incredibly slowly, actively hiding their bodies completely behind the hostages, constantly scanning the surrounding rooftops and police barricades. The tension in the air was incredibly thick and heavily suffocating. Up on the surrounding rooftops, the completely uncoordinated police officers were heavily sweating nervously, looking down the iron sights of their basic rifles. They were desperately trying to find a clear physical angle on the robbers, but the suspects were pressing themselves entirely too closely to the civilian hostages. The officers had absolutely no designated leader counting down a coordinated shot, and they had absolutely no clear protocol for when to actually pull the trigger. And then a single police officer on a nearby roof, heavily feeling the immense pressure and believing he briefly had a clear line of sight on one of the robbers, made a sudden unilateral decision. He pulled his heavy trigger. The loud, sharp crack of the rifle shot violently echoed down the busy avenue, but the officer completely missed his intended target. The heavy bullet violently smashed into the concrete near the robber's feet, and the absolute second that first shot rang out, total unmitigated chaos violently erupted on the street. Amais and Todorov physically flinched, violently shoved their hostages, and immediately began firing their handguns blindly and aggressively toward the police barricades. The other officers out on the street, hearing the sudden gunfire and completely panicking, immediately drew their standard sidearms and began firing wildly and aggressively toward the bank. The uncoordinated officers on the rooftops also began rapidly firing their rifles down into the street. Hundreds of heavy bullets violently ripped through the air in every physical direction. The large glass windows of the bank completely shattered violently, raining heavy shards of jagged glass down onto the concrete. The terrified civilians behind the barricades screamed and violently threw themselves flat onto the pavement. The live television cameras captured the entire chaotic, uncontrolled firefight as heavy smoke rapidly filled the avenue. The heavy shooting lasted for several long, incredibly chaotic seconds before the officers finally stopped firing, and the thick gray smoke slowly began to clear. And as the heavy dust settled on Prinzregentenstrasse, the police slowly walked forward with their weapons still raised, looking at the devastating physical results of their completely uncoordinated ambush. Dmitry Todorov was severely wounded, heavily bleeding on the concrete. Hans-Jörg Amais was lying completely motionless on the sidewalk, having been fatally struck by the massive barrage of police gunfire. But lying directly next to him on the blood-stained pavement was one of the innocent civilian hostages. During the wild, totally uncontrolled crossfire initiated by the completely untrained police force, a heavy bullet had violently struck the young hostage, instantly ending her life. The immediate aftermath of the bloody shootout was a massive, unprecedented national scandal. The entire West German public had physically watched the absolute tactical failure of their law enforcement agencies play out directly on live television. The government was heavily criticized for allowing regular, completely uncoordinated patrol officers to aggressively engage in a highly delicate hostage rescue using standard weapons and zero communication. The tragic televised death of the innocent hostage directly proved that the country's police forces were fundamentally and completely unequipped to handle modern, heavily armed criminal threats. And as a direct, immediate result of the disaster on August 4th, 1971, the West German government was completely forced to reinvent its entire law enforcement strategy, actively leading to the rapid formation of highly elite, specialized tactical units like the SEK and GSG-9, which are still heavily utilized to protect civilians today.